So, this is the 10th year since us and another group of people who are having a second meeting with. We had to do two meetings for this original drafters meeting because of time zone differences and stuff like that. So this is the first one today, and then the next one comes in about 8 hours with most of the Asia Pacific crew. But yeah, so on the 18th of August, it'll be 10 years since we were all hanging out at Eco Hummingbird Resort. So, so 10 years have passed, and we thought it would be a good idea to, try to take stock, as you say, of where things are at in terms of how the Peninsula Principles have been used in that 10-year period. Look more broadly at the question of climate displacement, as it is already in so many places manifesting, and then really try to come up with a whole series of proposals as to essentially new things that can be done in the coming period to bring a new gloss to this issue, because as we all know, the situation now, both in terms of sort of institutional attention to this question, as well as the physical manifestations of it, are far more extensive, both in good and bad ways, than they were in 2013. So there's now a plethora of groups that are working on this issue at civil society level, grassroots level, NGO level, UN level, and some governments. So it's a way more ubiquitous issue in an institutional way than it was in 2013. And the scale of the problem, of course, is far worse than I think even the most extreme predictions just 10 years ago. And we would be overjoyed if the predictions of the scale of climate displacement, which were bandied about in 2013 and before, actually turned out to be true, because they're probably by a factor of 4 or maybe even 8, maybe even 15 off the actual number. So the real numbers now, I mean, as you all know, to the extent that you're still involved in this issue, you never hear about any, except for the World Bank, which is inherently conservative, and some other words which I won't use. They use 216 million as their kind of official estimate, but everyone else is double, triple, quadruple that. Some people even more, right? So clearly the problem is not going away. The problem is only getting worse. And our task, to the extent that we have one, is to try to come up with creative, innovative, original but workable and practical ways that can be employed to do what the Peninsula Principles said, right? As you will all recall, remember Article 2, Principle 2 was the one that took us by far the longest to get through, the one that spoke of oh god, the word's escaping me now. I could grab it, but you will remember that it was about preemptive action and direct action on actual displacement. What was it? Facing. It was, remember, it was the facing word, like people that are facing climate displacement or something like that. So you see now when, I mean, I'm still working on this issue every day and, writing lots of reports and books and stuff about it. And you see there are all sorts of really interesting things happening in the world in a good way to address this very large problem, which, are obviously piecemeal in nature and very limited in terms of their scale and replicability. But nonetheless, they're building a floating town in the Maldives now. There's a whole neighborhood of Amsterdam that called Schoonschip, means clean ship, which is a floating suburb of Amsterdam. Really, really nice houses. The Dutchies also came up with an app, a phone app. You just type in your address and it will tell you how threatened your individual house is from flooding in an acute context within the next month. Will your house be flooded or not? I mean, all sorts of, mangrove planting and other coastal reinforcement measures are are being done in countless countries. Housing buybacks are happening in a range of countries, including Australia. Government just committed, I believe it was $700 million. It was a huge, huge infusion of money, particularly for the regular laggard that Australia is, to buy housing and land back from people in northern New South Wales and southern Queensland following the floods there around Lismore, because they don't want people settling in places that are floodplains. I was speaking recently to the government of Houston, Texas. They're spending hundreds of millions on housing buyback programs there so that people can get a new start away from the floodplains. And there's countless other examples that can be given, but as we all know, the scale of the problem is gargantuan and worsening. And if any of you have read, for instance, Gaia Vince's new book, Nomad Century, or a whole range of other books that have come out, even IPCC reports, which are notoriously careful, and particularly on this crew here, Robin knows more than anyone else, the scale of the problem and the speed of it are far, far, far worse than was ever predicted before. So it's going to be something that 1 out of every 4, 1 out of every 3 people in one way or another are going to experience directly. And of course, everyone on the planet is going to have to grapple with some manifestation of climate change. So, the principles are as valid as ever, and they're just one set of a whole range of different things. And we prepared this one document that we've sent to you where, just a very brief kind of overview of some of the places where the principles have been used. And our plan this year is to make a whole series of films, short films, very short, like advertisement length films, as in 10 to 20 seconds, on different issues relating to climate displacement, get those really to go viral, and then 4 or 5 kind of YouTube-y films, 4 to 6 minute things, and then also a feature film. So I'm speaking to a whole series of different kind of Hollywood director types. I just spoke to one this morning. I'm speaking to another one tomorrow to make a major kind of Hollywood film about Hollywood style, not in Hollywood, about this issue, but in a way that actually gets attention from, the masses, right? Not just some boring documentary with flooded streets and people wading up to their necks and all that. As important as those are, this has to be something that, really, really grabs people and gets people to act. So, that's just a, very brief overview of what we're planning. So we thought it would be nice to kind of come back together after 10 years and see what people are up to and see what you think about this whole question. And if you yourselves have new ideas of where things should go from here, and all of that. So why don't we start with Robin and just go to town, Robin?
Yes, well, thanks, Scott, for bringing us all together a decade ago. I have to say, I think I was more hopeful about where we would be at now as opposed to then. And what I mean by that is we have not reduced our greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, you've just highlighted all of these different places that are trying to address the issue of climate displacement, and it's not equitable, meaning those programs, at least in the United States, are not being provided in a way that's easy for people who are lower income and also live in communities that have historically been disenfranchised by the financial, political, and legal system that exists in the United States. So I'm actually heartbroken and distraught. I can hardly believe this is where we're at because I live in Alaska. We are now, a decade ago, we were saying we're warming twice as fast as the lower latitudes. Now we say we are warming 4 times as fast as the lower latitudes. Permafrost is predicted to be gone from the region of Alaska that I work in the most, which is the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. in the next 25 years, which is terrifying for many reasons. And so the work that we're doing now, so we were quite fortunate to get funding through the TED Audacious project, where we've gotten enough funding to provide 10 tribes with funding so that they can hire people within their communities to deal with this issue. And then we're looking at the policy, legal obstacles for the tribes to get access to the resources that they need, because more tribes in Alaska need to figure out how they are going to adapt to a radically different climate and no longer be able to stay in the places that they've called home for millennia. The Biden administration has tried to step it up. And so in the infrastructure legislation that was passed, wow, I can't even remember, honestly, when it was passed. It was over a year ago. There's actually a relocation assistance program that was included in that legislation that is specifically for Indigenous, federally recognized Indigenous tribes. 2 of the tribes are in Alaska, and each of those tribes received $25 million. That's not enough to make sure that those communities are entirely safe, but it's an acknowledgement of what is happening and what has happened now for quite a long time. It's still, the barriers to getting the resources are still exponential. So the relocation assistance program that I just described, there were no transparent criteria, so tribes didn't apply for it. The federal government chose the communities that would get that funding, and we have no idea if that funding is going to be available beyond these 3 communities. There are an additional 5 communities that receive $5 million to assist with the planning for relocation. Again, we have no idea what the criteria was that allowed those tribes to get access to those resources. So yeah, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And the activist lawyer in me says we need to be out in the streets because this is not going to get better. And we need to try to figure out how to better use the legal system to challenge what national governments are not doing to protect the people within their countries. And I think, well, maybe all of you don't know, I'm totally focused on the internal displacement of people. I am not looking at the cross-border movement of folks. And in the document that Scott shared before we met this evening, we filed a UN complaint with 10 special rapporteurs on behalf of 5 tribes, 1 of them in Alaska, 4 of them in Louisiana. We really wanted, and we filed that complaint when Trump was in office. So nothing happened with it. Biden came into office, and we really wanted an official visit for him, President Biden, to issue an official visit to the UN Special Rapporteur to do a fact-finding mission in Alaska. That didn't happen. And the Inter-American Human Rights Commission is about to visit Alaska on a different human rights petition that was filed based on that complaint. A hearing was held in November on climate-forced displacement of Indigenous peoples in the United States. And so we're hoping that with that level of advocacy, with the Inter-American Human Rights Commission coming to Alaska in 3 weeks, that will be a way for us to continue to elevate this issue, advocate for human rights protection for the peoples of the world who have done the least to cause the crisis that we are now all going to be faced with, because I think it's not just 1 in 3. I think we will all face this. And I don't think there are any safe places in the world to be, honestly, based on what I have borne witness to in Alaska. So I think I will stop there. And
Okay,
hi, Bruce.
thank you.
Hey, Robin. Sorry I'm late.
Do you want to talk now, or would you like Rick to go next? You name it.
No, Rick can go.
Okay. Look, I don't think it's really helpful for me to join the kind of doom and gloom chorus, because I haven't been actively involved with those sorts of things. What I have been doing that since, well, in 10 years, I finished up my position as regional rep in Australasia, where you remember, Scotty, we did some at that time, some extremely groundbreaking work on highlighting the situation of fragile Pacific Island nations in Nauru, Tuvalu, Kiribati, and the Carteret Islands. But at that time, it was very, very hard inside the UN system to get any real attention. You know, nobody really was thinking about the canary in the coal mine, if you like, of Nauru, sorry, of Tuvalu. Tuvalu since then has gone on to become quite a powerful voice and advocate of climate change particularly since I've been here. They've really managed to find their place a bit and been able to mobilize and galvanize a lot of geopolitical support from other, particularly small island nation states. If you add them all up together, they make quite a considerable bloc. You add the small island states of the Pacific and the Caribbean together, you've probably got about 1/5 or 30% of the UN vote. So it's quite, if they can get themselves organized politically, they can actually punch above their weight in terms of what they demand. And within the UN system, there was a special representative from Samoa, if I believe, who was doing some quite good work. Then I was in Malaysia for a few years and lost track a little bit of the climate change issue. I retired from UN in the middle of last year, but in the period during COVID, I spent a lot of time working the labyrinthian corridors of the UN system, trying to understand really where the humanitarian work that I've always done in my career fits with these other big parts of the system, the peace and security part, the development part, and all the other various, perhaps much more powerful parts of this, not necessarily more effective, but certainly the more powerful parts of the UN system here in New York. So what I wanted to do before it fades from memory completely is just share maybe a couple of reflections of how climate change and climate change displacement issues were being looked at here in the last few years, both in terms of attention, but also possibilities for further action. And that's something you might be interested, Scotty, as you're trying to find points of collaboration and leverage as we're going to go forward. So what I'll look at just quite quickly, one is the developments in the Security Council and how they've treated the whole question of climate change as a matter of international peace and security. Now, I think that's quite important, because the more those big, powerful bodies integrate and see climate change and all its various consequences and manifestations as an issue of international peace and security, then others can take their lead from it. Others in terms of work, in terms of resource mobilization, in terms of collaboration. And it's no surprise that politically in the Security Council, there has been a bit of a split. I wouldn't say the split's any easier today than it was 3 years ago, but on the one side, you had some very robust and very effective advocacy from the Irish and the Germans at the time, trying to get the Security Council to agree to a resolution that recognized that climate change it could lead, or is an important threat multiplier that leads to matters of international peace and security. On the other side of the fence were Chinese and Russians, and at the time India, which was on the revolving Security Council seat, and a less than helpful position taken by Brazil. So all of the work in the Security Council came to no avail. There was a resolution that was vetoed in 2021. You probably know some of this, but I think it's quite important just to have a look at it. In 2021, that resolution wasn't clearly not going to get across the line, so it failed. And the more proactive and creative parts of the Security Council membership continued to get strong references of climate change, displacement, climate change catastrophe as a peace and security issue into thematic resolutions, into thematic issues and country or region specific issues. So, for example, when they were looking at Somalia, particularly when they looked at Sahel, you will start to see increasingly references to climate change as one of a number of factors that gets fed into the kind of the mill that creates profound instability and therefore displacement in some circumstances. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, for refugees, Filippo Grandi, when I was there a couple of times was referring to climate change and forced displacement quite helpfully to try to get it into the kind of the psyche of the Security Council. So where are we today? 2022 was pretty frustrating. 2023 may offer some more opportunities. India is being replaced by Japan, and Japan is a far more positive force for these kinds of issues in the Security Council. Brazil has obviously changed its leadership, and Lula, I think, is a more useful protagonist or proponent of these issues than Bolsonaro. So there are possibilities, I think, in 23 and 24, if played cleverly, to get this issue more powerfully into the Security Council agenda. In the meantime, you know, the sideline disputes around Ukraine and Russia haven't been helpful in terms of trying to forge any kind of commonality of purpose. But on climate change, on these issues, that is one area where they seem to be able to agree. And that's what the Security Council needs to do to survive this difficult period, is to actually find issues that can transcend these deep polarities that are currently split it. So in terms of the interests of states, I think there may be some interesting work behind the scenes if we can talk to the right Security Council membership to get this issue back onto the agenda, make the links to displacement, and make sure it's trickling down into these various other bodies. So that quickly, I think, is one issue that's really quite interesting. The second one where I was working quite a lot over the last few years is the so-called, well, it was called the triple nexus. That was the what we call the humanitarian development peace nexus. And then there's a fourth element, which is the climate nexus. So there's a four-way looking at the way the system in the UN here in New York works: the humanitarian development, peace and security, and climate nexus. Not in rhetorical terms, but how that actually plays out in terms of cooperation. How does that play out in terms of resource mobilization is becoming a more important topic here in many parts of the UN system. I was quite involved with the rollout of the development system reform. And I don't want to get into all of the tedious parts of that, but to cut a long story short, what really happened with the development system reform was that they took the resident coordinator out of UNDP and created a self-standing position at every country position where the UN is present. So there's a resident coordinator, and his or her their responsibility is to try to forge a common plan amongst all those who are in the UN system, who are there working with government and working with civil society to make sure that development goals, SDGs and others, are implemented in a rather practical way. So it's quite an important instrument of collaboration. It provides, I mean, how successfully you can herd these cats is a big question, and can we get the humanitarians to be in and part of the development reform process? But in theory, at least, the Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework is a commonly owned instrument that all the UN country teams own. The banks can buy into it. It's signed off by governments. And at its core, there is a possibility to work in climate displaced populations. If the mantra of the SDGs is leave no one behind, clearly from a preventive point of view, Scotty, looking down the turnpike, you can say that these things are entirely predictable. Let's start working them into longer term integrated planning signed off by governments. And let's start looking for resources that can be attached to those kinds of initiatives. So I think for all its critique, there are opportunities there to make sure, if we can educate the resident coordinators, and we know a lot of them, if we can educate them to push hard on the displacement angle and hard on the climate change, the various elements of climate change, resilience, adaptation, but also displacement. Those are really practical areas where the system as a whole can start moving. So those are two things. In terms of the efficacy and effectiveness of some of these mechanisms, some on this call may know these mechanisms much better than I do, but I've seen a few of them in action, and I'm fairly impressed. The Security Council Informal Working Group on Climate and Security is made up of member states, but it can receive submissions. Its mind can be turned to looking at the sort of things that we're interested in the Peninsula Principles. And of course, what they think, what they write goes fed in directly into the thinking and the considerations of the Security Council. The group of friends in climate security is also quite an important body of state entities that will be worth knowing who they are and knowing who in those are our friends and who are the likely champions, because I think this is really where it's at, is to try to find like-minded states or people within states who can make a difference to this, and then start to forge the kind of collaborations that are going to be important to make this work. If you see that climate displacement is also not the sole driver of other things, if the prognosis is that by 2050, 80% of the world's population is going to be living in cities, then we also have to start looking at the relationship between natural migration from rural areas to city areas, and then climate change and impact on cities where most of the world's population is going to be. So that's certainly something the World Bank is looking at in terms of its financing. A lot of the World Bank strategy on the gap in climate financing is focused in on the impact on cities, which is probably the right thing. Not, however, of course, you know, again, if a lot of the crops and the livelihoods that sustain the cities disappears because of climate change, then you've got huge cities, but no way to feed them, which is obviously going to be a huge problem. I don't know where the Peninsula Principles fits in all of this, but it seems to me they're an important reference point that could be fed into the thinking, the framework thinking of a lot of these various entities. I don't know, you've done a lot of work to propagate them, Scott, but how far that's been done, I don't know. I'd be happy to, I'll be in New York for a bit longer. I'd be happy to start doing a little bit of a survey on your behalf if it's useful, to try and see, you know, who's here, who likes, who would find these interesting and useful. What's clear in the UN system in New York is that they're desperate to show, that's particularly Guterres and Ryder, who's Volker's successor as the sort of chief coordinator within the UN system, they're desperate to show the value of the multilateral system in this very, very complicated period of division and schisms and within the member states. And it might well be that climate change displacement is one of the areas where there can be an emerging consensus, where states in their own interests might be more progressive and more accommodating than they have been in the past, because they know that a lot of other fights they've got to do, and the things that are going to keep the Chinese and the Russians and the US and Europeans apart in some areas may actually coalesce around things that are perhaps not quite so difficult for them. So just I think I'll stop there. I hope I don't sound too New Yorky, Scott and Kirsten, after all that, but I've tried to keep it reasonably practical. I think apart from all of the acronyms and the processes here, there are some interesting things going on here. There are heavyweight government representatives who come into town, and there are things that really where the humanitarian peninsula principles could actually be advanced quite usefully, I think. So I think I'll stop there.
That's great. Well, you know, thank you very, very much. That was totally interesting to see how it really has infiltrated the whole system, you know, at every level. But now, obviously, what can that system do with this newfound awareness of the scale of the problem? And, you know, we love stats and statistics and weird numbers, and we always come up with weird numbers related to this question. And part of this process this year, focusing on the Peninsula Principles again, 10th anniversary, we're going to revisit all of these calculations that we made also 10 years ago in 2013 about the scale of how much land is actually required globally if we were to actively rehouse every single person in the world that was displaced by climate change, right? And at the time, 10 years ago, we came up with this figure: 0.14% of the Earth's land surface is all that we need in order to rehouse every single person who would be displaced by climate change. So 1/700% of all the land surface is what we need in order to rehouse everyone, right? So it's not a question of land supply, but we're going to do all this new statistical work on that question and come up with a more advanced figure. And we've also done calculations in terms of costings. So how much is it going to cost? So bear in mind the Secretariat of the UN's annual budget these days, I don't know what it is, but it's certainly not more than 10 billion or 20 billion max, right? I think UNHCR is like 8 billion, right? So, you know, let's either go party down or get really fascist and authoritarian about things, you know. But you know,
So
these
Scott,
are
yeah, sorry to
go ahead.
interrupt, but with your statistics, so have you calculated how much land is going to disappear with sea level rise? And in what time frame?
Well, those are all, we didn't calculate that, but it's fully available. Don't worry. Yeah. But the other, you know, the other dimension to that, of course, we will lose lots of coastline. And there's all these, you know, there's a lot of statistical and, you know, mapping and geographical work that's been done showing, you know, losses over time, depending on different scenarios. And we're actually working on that. We're working on a project now to kind of develop a global app that will monitor all of the world's 365,000 kilometers of coastline, so that you can type in your address and get a 100-year prognosis based on like 20 or 30 data points, what's going to happen to your particular piece of land over time. That's our goal anyway. We'll see if we can, you know, get the funding that we need for that. But so that's going to happen. But I was going to ask you later, Robin, but now that it's on the table, let me ask you. So, you know, this famous book recently, Gaia Vince and a whole bunch of other people, you know, called Nomad Century, and a whole range of other books and reports, interviews even that, you know, Kadir von Lohausen, you know, our very close friend who's won the World Press Photo Award many times, one of the leading climate photographers, photojournalists in the world. You know, on one of his missions, on a DS mission to Greenland, you know, he interviewed this Greenland farmer family. And, you know, this was years ago. And the woman who was interviewed, you know, Kadir saying, you know, so what do you think about climate change? You know, are you afraid of it? You know, what are you going to do? She goes, we love it. We love it. We can grow berries. We can grow lettuce. We can grow broccoli, all these foods we could never grow before. We're so abundant. We have so much food now that we can grow, you know, so that, you know, totally flip things on its head. And you have this line, like I'm noticing it, the more, you know, the more I delve into this topic, there is a line, an angle on all of this that, you know, which would be super interesting to get your opinion on, because you live there, you know, in the Arctic and in the northern climes, that these areas, which have traditionally been non-inhabitable by and large by humanity, are suddenly going to be opened up and are suddenly going to become, you know, temperate climates, no longer subject to the extremes of you know, winter weather and permafrost, et cetera, et cetera. And as the theory goes, you know, the greatest beneficiary in the world of global warming is Russia, right? And northern Canada and Alaska and Greenland and a couple other places, which can't handle very large populations now, but in fact will become the focal point for mass global migration as people migrate further north, away from the, you know, 20 points above and below the equator. And so that will be the next boom era, will be, you know, in the northern climes, places which have never been really occupied by very many people. So what do you think about that? You must have heard about all these scenarios.
I have, and I'm not convinced. You know, I mean, if permafrost thaws, it makes it really hard to build infrastructure and put that on top of mud, which is basically what happens when permafrost thaws. Yeah, I mean, I have heard that. I would be surprised, because the ways that the climate crisis is going to impact different parts of the world make, in my mind, all parts of the world not safe. And what I mean by that is we don't have the infrastructure built to deal with the climate that's coming our way. If we invested in that, then I think there are possibilities to make it through what will be, you know, these extreme storm events that are happening all over the world. And we just have not built the structures that we live in and work in to withstand, you know, hurricanes that have over 250 mile per hour winds. So
Mhm.
I think that
Mhm.
that's the issue that with the question that you asked is, are we investing in that infrastructure to make it climate resilient?
Yeah, and that brings up, of course, the classic issue of the limitations of current forms of governance that we have on this planet, and current limits on very short-term democratic election processes and things of that nature, whereby long-term planning is simply excluded always in the interests of immediate electability, right? So I was talking the other day to super interesting guy. He's called Henk Ovink, a Dutch guy. He's their Dutch water ambassador, and I'm not sure if he works for the UN now or whatever, but he's definitely a Dutchie and probably the leading water guy in the world. And I used to live in Holland myself. I'm a Dutch citizen and stuff. And so I asked him, so Hank, when you retire, are you gonna go back to Holland? Because I think he lives in New York now. Are you gonna go somewhere else? It's like, maybe in the short term it would be okay, but I think in 100 and 200 year timeframes. And I said, so what's Holland going to be like in like 100 years? And he said, no one is going to want to live there. In Holland, right? Who has managed water better than any country in the history of humanity, 500 years ahead of Bangladesh's water management system today, right? Holland will be a morass, a swamp, a very sticky, ugly, horrible place to be, full of dengue mosquitoes and all the rest, and people will just leave, right? So there's that whole scenario too of all these places, which we all know that Holland is low and that it will be flooded and things, but there's a lot of countries in the world which are incredibly advanced, incredibly developed now, incredibly wealthy, which will not be in the near to long term, in addition to the areas that are already extremely poor, right? So there's no chance people are going to stay where they are. If people have to move, then they're going to move, and it's a question of, are we prepared to manage this movement and turn a negative into something somehow positive? Like rural to urban migration can be very positive in general terms, or are we just going to have a sort of laissez-faire approach, every person for themselves, and you duke it out until you can get the highest place on a mountain, far away from the rising seas? Or are we going to have a world like like one of my favorite movies of all time, and I'm a total movie guy, top 25 for sure, it's called Code 46. Most people have never seen it, but I think that more than anything captures the essence of probably what the world's going to look like in 50 to 100 years, which is essentially city states, the return to the city state, the Sparta idea, surrounded by absolute carnage, big walls around the city states protecting those with resources and those who cannot get in, trying to constantly get in. And climate change gives us the opportunity really to see ourselves as one species. This is like the de facto alien that's coming from outer space. Finally, this one force that's going to affect us all could be the force that finally brings us together and unifies us in a way that we've never been able to do until now, 193 nation states and all the rest. And so try to turn that negative into something positive. And I think if we don't go in that direction, you can call it international cooperation or the international community or United Nations, whatever you want to call it, the chances of us coming up with adequate defenses and adequate forms of governance that are sufficient to tackle the scale of the problem simply will not emerge. Self-interest will always then, prevail in terms of nationalistic sentiments, etc. So, it opens up, this whole issue opens up a Pandora's box of possibilities. And it's a little bit like slums in the world. We all know the solution to slums, and yet 1 out of every 6 people on planet Earth today lives in a slum. It would be simple to solve that problem technically, but we don't do it. And it's probably going to go in that direction when it comes to climate change. We know what needs to be done, but will we do it? Alone, we know we cannot do it, but will we transcend our differences and get together and unify in such a way that we actually can grapple with it in a way that keeps make sure that the center holds, make sure that things remain relatively stable and it doesn't kind of break out into a Hobbesian reality of war of all against all, So that's my two, Bob. So let's go to Bonnie. And so Bonnie, you have the floor.
Thanks, Scott. It's great to see everybody, and I really enjoyed being part of the drafting process, and it's really exciting to see everybody. Robin, I saw you at Harvard several years ago, but it's still been a while. I'm going to take a somewhat different approach to the question Scott proposed, because I haven't had as much time to address the climate change displacement issue squarely for the last few years. And my environmental work's focused more on environment and armed conflict. So I'm going to look at some of the questions, some reflections on the Peninsula Principles through that lens, as well as through the more straightforwardly through the climate change displacement lens. So I had three major reflections I thought I'd offer. First was the Peninsula Principles were explicitly designed to be a normative framework to address the rights of persons internally displaced, as we say, and I think Principle 1, I think we said, but they use the term normative framework. And although it's a non-binding, expert-driven document, it still constitutes a set of norms. And so in a sense, they're akin to a treaty or a political commitment of sorts. So therefore, I'd say on their 10th anniversary, it's a time not only to celebrate their successes we've had, but also to engage, I would suggest, in a kind of a review conference of the type that you would engage in with other such instruments. And review conferences typically produce certain types of outcome documents. I'm obviously taking an international law lens here. And the first, they generate assessments of the progress that's been made so far. And Scott, you've done some of that in the background paper you sent around about how the Peninsula Principle has been adopted by certain countries and promulgated in various measures. But analysis could be done on how individual principles have been implemented in different forms. So not just the principles as a whole, but how individual principles have been implemented, either explicitly with reference to the Peninsula Principles or more explicitly or implicitly been implemented. So that'd be one thing that could be done. Second, review conferences often issue declarations where they reiterate actors' commitments of the objectives of the instrument and the goals for the next period of time. So whether that comes from a group of experts like us or from some other body, but that's another thing that often comes out of like 10-year review conferences. And the third thing is that the conferences generally adopt action plans, which focus on the way that instruments are being implemented. So in this case, a plan could look at the national policies that have been explicitly drawn on the Peninsula Principles, such as the ones you cited in your paper, Scott, or they could look at other laws and policies that serve as models for how it could be implemented going forward. So, and it also, as part of an action plan, you could look at interpretations that may need to be fleshed out in light of how developments in climate change over the past 10 years. So maybe not necessarily revising the principles, but how interpretations could be refined, given some of the things we've talked about. So that was my first reflection. The second was that in addition to reviewing and building on the Peninsula Principles, there may be opportunities for proponents to look for new forums to raise the climate change displacement issue. And one forum, and you may all have thought of this already, as I say, I'm not quite as immersed in the issues I was previously, although I hope to be again. Just been a matter of time, not lack of interest. But so one forum could be the proposed fossil fuels non-proliferation treaty. And I was at a meeting related to this very recently. And it's not an initiative I'm personally involved with, but as I say, I was at a meeting. And it seeks to phase out fossil fuels and achieve a just transition. And so therefore it's focused on preventing the harm climate change causes, obviously, which would include displacement. And one thing I've noticed is they look at some of the models they look to do include disarmament treaties, such as the Mine Ban Treaty. And those treaties include not only preventive measures, but also remedial measures. So in that case, not only prohibitions on use of mines, but also like things like victim assistance. So I wondered if it would be interesting to see if there are ways that something like the Fossil Fuels Treaty, which has a humanitarian aim, could be provide support to the victims of climate change, such as displaced persons. So that would be, I don't know if the organizer would support this idea, but I think it could be interesting to see if there'd be a way to weave in some, I know they're concerned about climate displacement, but would there be a way to weave that kind of thing into their proposal? So that's a new possibility of a new form. And then the final reflection was that advocates working on climate displacement could look to other issue areas for inspiration and potential alliances. So this again draws on my work that there are interesting intersections with efforts to address the effects of nuclear weapons testing, and more broadly, what we call toxic remnants of war, which is generally any of the environmental effects of armed conflict or military operations. Nuclear testing obviously caused widespread displacement that continues to this day, and like climate change, relates to an existential threat. Much has been written in recent years about different ways to address the nuclear testing, including through assisting victims and remediating the environment. The 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons actually includes obligations on those two areas. The clinic at Harvard, for which I work under my supervision, published principles for implementing those two obligations. And states parties last summer adopted an action plan that lays out specific steps for implementing those obligations. And there's some of the provisions in the Peninsula Principles are very similar to some of the principles in the action plan and the ones that we've laid out at Harvard. So, and some of both the steps, such as like having budgets and action and national plans, laws and policies, international cooperation, assistance, and so forth, but also broader principles like non-discrimination, inclusion of affected communities, and so forth. So given the parallels between the Peninsula Principles and some of these principles, I wondered if there'd be some lessons learned for implementation, some precedent there and some, practical steps that might be learned. And I also think there might be some opportunities for collaboration among the advocates and affected communities. When I was in the Marshall Islands before the pandemic, so I think it was 2018, or 19, I think it was 18, and repeatedly heard that the two main concerns of the people there were the effects of nuclear weapons testing, people are still displaced from it, and climate change, not surprisingly. And it'd be interesting to see that those issues are not being and competing for attention, but working together and dealt with in coordination. So maybe there are ways we could get the communities and the advocates working together on that front. So those are sort of three, somewhat related, but not completely related observations from my area of work. So thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Bonnie. That's great to have that angle, because we don't usually, we don't always look in that direction to, think of things to do in terms of the fossil fuels thing and the nuclear weapons stuff. I think particularly that latter issue is, really a good idea to, because, over and above the Marshalls, everywhere in the Pacific, well, not everywhere, but a lot of places where testing occurred, that's obviously going to be right up there, nuclear remnants and climate change. So somehow figuring out how to combine those two into something beyond what's been done before. I don't know precisely what form that could take, but progress is being made clearly in terms of addressing this, there is no above ground nuclear testing anymore, for instance, which is, if you asked that question in the 1950s, people would have said, of course, it's never going to end. We have to keep testing, right? So, things that seem impossible do actually come true sometimes. So, and then it brings it back to that whole existential question that the uniquely faces the islands, right, compared to other parts of the world. The people that did the least to deserve the fate that they have been dealt, both in terms of being victims of nuclear weapons and then rising sea levels, is really shocking. So finally they get their moment in the sun, so to speak. So thank you very much again, Bonnie. Now over to Bruce. So Bruce, maybe you can talk not only about your work on the what is it called? It's not Administrative Appeals Tribunal, but anyway, the Migration Review Tribunal, where you've written your many famous decisions. But also maybe a word or two about the new advisory opinion case that's been put before the ICJ, driven by the law students from Port Vila in Vanuatu. That'd be interesting to hear your take on that as a quasi-Pacificer.
Yeah, thanks, and apologies for being late. I mean, what I thought I might do is I've got a couple of reflections that sort of fall out of work that I've been doing in the 10 years since we were last all together in Mornington and in your pool, Scott. So look, yeah, so just since then, I've continued in the role at the IPT, but also I've accumulated other things, and principally becoming an advisor to our Foreign Affairs Department on climate mobility. There's a couple of things that fall out of that I think might be quite useful. I'll park the ICJ advisory opinion to one side for the moment. Look, I've got two reflections on the Peninsula Principles, and the first one is like implementation is everything. You know, we can have as good of models, good of frameworks, great legal developments, but if they're not actually operationalized or used or what have you, who cares, right? I heard this hilarious story up in the, I can't remember who told me about, it was about funding, right? And they said, oh my God, man, the EU funding application for adaptation is like this thick. It's a disaster. The Chinese are like one A4 sheet of paper, they give you 5 times the money. Go, what do you do with the EU one? And they used it to weight down the tin shed roof when the wind blew. Because it was just, you know, great intention, but nobody used it. It was a doorstop in one guy's office, and it kept the roof on when the wind blowed in the Cat 4, right? Totally useless. So, and that speaks to sort of, I think one of the key things I'm really coming around to in terms of sort of the legal side of it is that having developments in the legal space is great. You know, so trying to put out there a range of cases which say, well, here are some possibilities within the context of law, and here's how we can sort of configure existing principles within international human rights law to sort of reach into this space is great. But if it's not really being picked up or used, then that's sort of problematic. And there, I think there is something to think about in terms of what might be next steps for DS Scott. And here I'm thinking not so much about the particular principles in themselves, but the suite of things that you've been doing that we've sort of interacted with in the years since. Because one of the things that I have been doing in the past sort of 10 years is through the IRMJ, the International Association of Refugee and Migrant Law Judges, talking about this, educating and saying, whether you like it or not, this is coming down the road in some way, shape or form in your country. And you need to understand there's a new language, there's some framework documents out there you need to get ahead of, and to try and sort of prime the system of decision makers, judges and the like to be at least thinking about this if not equipped to deal with it. I have to say, I think in large measure that's possibly fallen on somewhat deaf ears. There's been some studies that have come out recently by a guy called Matthew Scott in the European context. So even we've got countries like the Nordic countries where they have hard-baked legal mechanisms built into their statutory framework, decision makers, judges aren't using them, don't know how to use it, don't know how to operationalize them. And it's sort of got me thinking around, well, what's the place of a document like the Peninsula Principles in a legal process? And I think it's a source. It's a lot of good action is happening at that subnational level. It's at local courts, district courts, where local decision makers and local bodies are being held to account about decisions they're making in relation to disaster risk reduction, disaster preparedness, or whatever the case may be. And I think there's probably a case to be made. I'm not sure to what extent the Peninsula Principles are being used as a tool in terms of driving cases, or the degree to which DS is looking and thinking about how do we begin to use them as a way to perpetuate strategic litigation within countries. I don't know. It's something that I think they could be usefully configured for. And yeah, implementation is everything. In a way, we're ahead of the curve. There's a lot of stuff that's been happening, getting around us. We're catching up to where we landed 10 years ago, and that's a good thing. But also, I think there's an autonomous space for them as a tool to use within the legal process, because if decision makers, whether it's in a protection space at an international level or at a domestic accountability purpose, if decision makers and judges aren't equipped to decide those cases, then that's a problem. And if they're not giving the right tools to enable them to make decisions, then that's something which I think is eminently rectifiable, if with great difficulty. And in terms of the ICCJ case, look, it's obviously a fantastic initiative of exactly this sort of thing. You know, it's a group of kids getting together saying, hey, we can do this, and then really being supported by a law firm, Blue Ocean Law, I think they are, and then this being picked up on by states. I was at a meeting of PIFs. The PIFs have had it's a closed meeting. I can't really give a readout of it, but the fact they had this meeting on statehood it is public knowledge. So I was flown up there by the Pacific Island Forum they're going to sort of think out what some legal strategies may be around preserving statehood and what that may mean for the protection of people. And the last day of this thing was the Friday when there was the vote in the General Assembly, the unanimous vote to support this, right? And so that was it was a fortuitous timing. This conference could have been the week before or the week after, but it sent a ripple of euphoria through the delegates at this meeting. And it really speaks to the way in which I think the Pacific community of nations are really taking a leadership role in this whole area in a way that was perhaps not so true when we were drafting the Pacific Principles. Yes, there was an awareness of it, but 2013 and that run up to 2013, states were generally very reluctant to talk about this. Communities were a little bit reluctant to talk around this. But you know, in the 10 years since then, that has changed in quite a fundamental way. And this sort of brings me on to the second reflection. I mean, one of the things I have picked up on in the 10 years is to sort of become an advisor to our foreign affairs and trade department around mobility in the context of climate and disasters. I guess there's sort of two things here. I mean, the first of all, just to say what we've done is what I've designed or refined and then gone out for public procurement. We're just launching a very detailed research program designed to get Pacific-based researchers across a range of countries using Pacific-based methodologies to really try and reach into different components of the various things which drive people to move away. It's a sense of sort of wrest control back from UN agencies, a tendency for agencies to come in and just do stuff, tick boxes and get out again. There's a sense from the research community in the Pacific that this was producing bad data, not really good evidence base for decision makers for policy development in the Pacific. So it's an attempt to wrest to try and sort of decolonize some of the research space and to generate really rich data. It includes like family-based studies and things of that nature. That was one of the key messages that came across. There's millions and millions of dollars worth of research, and so it's underway now. And I'm raising that because one of the things that sort of came through, and I think when we talk, and this picks up on a point that Bonnie was raising about, well, what's the point of a 10-year thing? And it's reflection. What do we know now that we sort of didn't know then or didn't quite get then that might cause us to reflect and adjust in terms of how we're thinking about the principles? And the signature thing that I landed on was Principle 5. It's like 2 lines. States have obligation to prevent and avoid climate displacement. And to me, that's everything. And I think in the Pacific context, Scotty, that would resonate. Doing anything in the Pacific, Principle 5 needs to be at the heart of whatever you're doing in terms of engagement, because it's a little bit unfortunate. We had this meeting up in Suva, and then like 6 weeks later, I crashed my bike and gave myself a brain injury and all this sort of terrible stuff. But in the meantime, Foreign Affairs got sort of like, between you and me, they got on the IOM thing came along, right? And so it all became migration, and it had this particular patina and lens put to. So by the time my sort of brain recovered and all this sort of stuff, I had to try and reshape the narrative. But what's come out really super clearly is that even talking about like climate mobility is wrong. It's about staying in place. And so part of the idea about the research is trying to understand that when people move, even if you are displaced, you never sort of leave. When you move, have you ever left home? What constitutes home? All this sort of stuff is designed to sort of put a cultural lens around it and trying to have a deeper understanding around what this may mean. So if you're in a village, you know, say a Cat 3 rolls through, your bure is blowing down, but you just, you know, and this, you'll go to your auntie, uncle's, goro's bure, are you actually displaced? You know, you may just go from one home to another, really, in this worldview. It's not, we may call it, oh, you're sort of technically displaced, but culturally, yeah, it's possibly a different lens. And so the one thing that I would say my reflection on all this, and this is coming out of this, the last 2 years I've pivoted away from sort of global stuff to do deep dives into the Pacific, right? Because it's sort of the backyard, so you've got to take care of home, right? So, you know, and I'm just beginning to think that, you know, in terms of engagement here, I think we may need to sort of be a little bit careful about some of the assumptions we're making around what is or what isn't displacement. But then really, in terms of any engagement here, I would certainly be leading with principle 5 as the way into it, and that would get engagement at that community level, because communities are super engaged here. Youth are super engaged, and again, we see that through the ICJ thing that you've just referenced. And so there's an energy here to talk about this stuff and to sort of be proactively engaged with this stuff, so not just passive, but actively as people with agency and choice and vision and wisdom and culturally situated tools and concepts to enable us to sort of deal with the issues at hand. So those are sort of the 2 reflections that I sort of had that I thought I'd share, and happy to answer any questions, conversation.
Excellent. So, you know, let's stay with the Pacific for a second. So, you know, and so many things have happened in the last 10 years just in the Pacific that, you know, we're certainly not there in 2013, right? Everybody, you know, the way I always, you know, present the whole question of climate change and climate displacement, you know, there was originally a heavily disproportionate, fair enough, but it was disproportionate amount of attention to the small islands because they were going to get blasted first, right? But when you know, add up the total number of people affected, it's minuscule compared to the people living in the Vietnamese Delta or in Bangladesh or in the eastern coast of China or the east coast of the US. I mean, that there we're starting to talk about, you know, hundreds of millions of people, right? Pacific as a whole, if you don't include, you know, PNG, is only 5-6 million people. So it's a very manageable number actually compared to the scale of displacement elsewhere. Not to forget, you know, the Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa, etc. So one of the newer things that has come, of course, is the whole geopolitical question and significance of the Pacific vis-a-vis the battle between, you know, the US and China. That has like gone stratospheric by comparison to 10 years ago. The whole Taiwan question and recognition of Taiwan by, you know, previously Kiribati and others that no longer represent Taiwan, that whole dimension has come. The South China Sea has come, where China has actually built brand new islands out of sandbars using technology which could be transferred to a number of these heavily threatened atoll nations, whereby they could do the same thing there. And I'm sure that day, if it hasn't come already, it's certainly being discussed in the halls of the, you know, People's Assembly in China. Let's go down and offer to do the same thing we did in the South China Sea for the lovely new friends that we have in Kiribati, for instance. We can preserve South Tarawa with Chinese technology and we can reinforce islands and allow you to stay there for 100 or 200 years. So that, you know, very heavy geopolitical significance of things of that nature. Then we have the, you know, the increased unification of the Pacific Island Forum and the countries there in terms of, you know, projecting this whole blue Pacific idea, the kind of de facto European Union model of the Pacific that they're talking about. They're even talking about a currency, you know, a shared new currency. So things are really, really changing, you know. And then when you look specifically at the displacement dimensions, you know, more and more evidence is on the table that this is, you know, very much well underway. You know, the people from Ontong, Java, where we had a guy living for 3 or 4 months in the Solomons, you know, they want to move, and they don't want to, but they realize they have to. And, you know, they're getting offered land on Malaita, which is the closest nearest landmass that's, you know, highly elevated, but they don't want to move there because it's a different ethnic group. You know, it's Polynesians versus Melanesians, all that kind of issue, still very, very, you know, real. The Carteret Islands, you know, we've been working with Ursula Rakova and Tulele Paisa and others there since 2005. So what is that now? 18 years, you know, completely not resolved. And it's, you know, it's a few hundred people that they needed to relocate from the Carterets onto Bougainville. Absolutely not completed. You know, Fiji has these, what is it now, 200 villages or something that are slated for relocation. I mean, they've started with 4 or 5.
Yeah, the number varies. I've heard different reports.
Yeah, it's kind of growing though. It's definitely not declining. And then you have the whole land purchase, right? The land purchase that Anote Tong's government from Kiribati did in Vanuatu in Fiji, the 7,000 acres of land. So there's a lot of, I mean, all this stuff is really very real, but I think what's kind of also lacking is what you were mentioning, the prevent and avoid dimension of it, but also the solutions side of it. Because, you know, none of these so-called solutions are particularly great in an area where you alluded to it. You know, this whole question of one's relationship to one's land in the Pacific is very much akin to the way indigenous people everywhere relate to their land, right? Land and human are the same. They cannot be separated. They are exactly the same thing. You know, you cannot take a person from their land and vice versa. So if somebody's displaced in the Pacific in most countries and forced to leave their familial land, they are never, ever on their land again for the rest of their life. They're always on someone else's land. And the mental impact that has, the cultural impact that has and will have on large numbers of people cannot be, you know, underestimated at all. You can't simply just give somebody a new piece of land and say, this is your new piece of land. It's not our land, it's someone else's land. And so many complex factors, you know, are at play. But at the end of the day, you know, as hard and complex as it all is, you know, it's also, because of the small numbers of people, potentially easier to solve in a kind of rights-based way than it would be in a lot of other regions. You know, you're going to have more people displaced in Beijing or Bangkok than you will in the entire Pacific.
Yeah, I don't know if I buy that, right? I don't know if I buy this sort of thing that it's only a few number of people. So I think you've got to be careful about that. So I really do. I mean, yes, in absolute numbers, you're right. It's unarguable. But I mean, you know, if the Chinese government want to move 100 million people, they just move 100 million people, right? Who's going to argue? It's actually not so simple. It's actually far harder to move 10 people off someone's land in a country where there's only like 5% of publicly owned land than moving 500,000 people in China. I just think we've got to be careful about these sorts of assumptions that it's just simply, it's two numbers are deterministic of issues of complexity or what have you. I sort of a little bit resistant to that.
I agree with you, Bruce, completely,
you know,
because I mean, I think I really appreciated what everybody said. And I think the comment that you made, Bruce, about implementation is key. And in the work that I've done, I mean, my sense from having done this for almost 20 years is that governments just have a giant resistance to managing the internal movement of populations. It is a space they do not want to get into because of the horrific legacies. And, you know, and we're still in this context where if an extreme weather event happens that damages like infrastructure, you get gobs of money in theory to repair that infrastructure. If you want money in advance to protect people in the places where they call home, it's much more difficult to get that funding to protect that community. And then the way that that funding is determined is not equitable. At least that's what's happening in the United States, because there are these giant protection projects that are now in process that are going to cost $50 billion. And they're being very strategic about who's protected and who's not. And so, you know, and that's why the doom and gloom, it's like I'm being real, because we have been facing this in Alaska now for almost 20 years. And there's been almost no movement by the government to actually address this in a proactive way that would keep people in the places they call home. Or even, you know, now we're working with tribes who have come to the decision that they have to relocate. They cannot stay where they are. And there's no process in place for them to implement that decision. And so we're pushing the system to create the process, and it's just not set up to do that. I mean, the implementation is so complicated when you're moving people from the place they call home to a completely new location where they have to figure out how they're going to sustain their livelihoods and either integrate into another community or create a whole nother community that they're gonna make their own.
I mean, I call it cultural preparedness in my own mind, right? I mean, you sort of think, what's, you know, in this thing I did for the Red Cross, it's called something called place-based programming, right? So, you know, it's like, okay, we sort of got the idea, we're not building shelter in settlements, we're building shelter. Okay, that's a mind shift, that's a good one, but not good enough, right? We're not building shelter, we're building homes. Okay, that's improvement. Again, not good enough. We're building place. If you don't create that sense of place, you're too long a way away where you feet hit the ground, right? All sorts of horrible things happen. People just don't give a shit about the place you're located to. They prefer to go back home and all that stuff. So people self-refuel, self-migrate, call it what we like. And this lack of preparedness that Robin's talking about, it's everywhere. And I think this is a space where DS could like super usefully inhabit. And I call it cultural preparedness. If we really are talking this long-term time frame for, you know, this, we might be needing to move quite a large amount of people from indigenous communities, people with other but no less intimate connections to land. This is wrapped up around space and place, in the concept of space and place. And to replicate space and place somewhere else takes time. But if you do it right, then you're reducing trauma, all this stuff that we were talking about. So maybe it's a sacred rock. Maybe there's a culturally appropriate place where you can transport that somewhere else. You can, the cave, you never get all of it done. Maybe it's a tree, maybe it's a plant, maybe it's something where you have a culturally appropriate way to, you know, and so sort of thinking about all this sort of stuff. And it's not just, you know, getting provisions in place and, you know, pre-positioning shelters and tents and all that sort of, important though that is, you know, and pre-positioning, getting finance and having flexible financing, early warning systems, all that, that's all good stuff. But at this scale, the cultural dimension, cultural preparedness for moving people is completely off the radar. And I reckon this is the super most important space. And I completely agree with Robin. It's lacking. And I think that's a super useful space for maybe DS to think about, because you do that right, then lots of good things happen, I think.
Yeah, you know, the quintessential question, right, in the Pacific and many other places, particularly indigenous ones that are affected by climate change, it's the Clash song, you know, it's should I stay or should I go, right? It's the existential question for which there is no patent answer, you know. It's impossible to decide to stay or to go, because no matter which way you go, you're going to lose, right? In some way, shape, or form, you're going to lose. Do we argue as outsiders, and do we encourage the people of Tuvalu to just fight and fight and fight until the last moment, until everyone who could have left has left. The infrastructure has crumbled, all in the interests of saving that beautiful country, the 9 islands that comprise it? Or do you argue that it might be better to plan ahead, but plan ahead in a kind of a unique and creative way, bearing in mind that almost every relocation ever done in the history of humanity has failed in some way or another, usually major. Most relocation / involuntary resettlement has indeed been that. What Robin was saying, I think the reason that governments don't want to engage in internal relocation now is not because they don't know how to do it or because it's too expensive necessarily. It's because they're so used to the 200 years that they've had having their own way with people, involuntarily shifting people around by the hundreds of millions across the planet to get their profits higher. Just look at Burma today, or any number of countries where mass displacement is common, in order for the military or others to make money out of it. I think it's that they don't want to do. They don't want to move people purely for humanitarian or human rights reasons, unless they themselves are going to be able to exploit, the land that was left behind. So, there's no easy answer. I've discussed with officials in Tuvalu, in Funafuti, the idea of raising the level of the land, right? Like serious discussions. How do we raise Funafuti by 7 or 9 meters so that it, can be in place for 100 years longer? It's reached that level of consideration. I mean, when has that ever happened in, human history? Then there was the idea of moving the entire country to Kiowa. Do you remember that one? Kiowa, the island in Fiji, which is now exclusively Tuvaluan people. There was the idea of moving all of the 12,000 Tuvaluans onto Kiowa as a group, so that they could kind of maintain, the cultural heritage and the history and the memory of Tuvalu there. But then, that's moving to another country. Even though it's occupied by Tuvaluans now, it's occupied exclusively by members of one island, Vaitupu, the most elite, kind of highly educated, wealthy island of Tuvalu, and that would have created tension. So you could have moved everybody there in theory, but even that is replete with problems. But just to go back to the issue, so I'm not at all downplaying the significance of the moving of Pacific Islanders, man. I'm simply saying that we shouldn't throw our arms up in the sky and say that it's absolutely impossible to do, because this is something, if you take the perspective of, let's say, principle 5, prevent and avoid first, right? Put all of, most of your eggs or all of your eggs in that basket first, let's see to the extent to which we can do it. Then you got to look at the science, and you got to look at the predictions. And, the atoll nations of the Pacific, not Fiji, not Solomon's necessarily, but the atoll nations are in, very serious jeopardy. And there's nothing they can do in geoengineering terms, really, to save themselves. If all of the ice melts on our solitary planet, sea levels rise by 70 meters. So nobody's building 70-meter high embankments, right? So there is a kind of inevitability for some of the Pacific Islands that movement has to take place. But the question is how to do it, who decides, what happens when you give a little hint that that's the way you're going to go as a government, and then suddenly those with resources decide to flee to South Auckland, set up shop there, leaving behind only, the elderly, children, the infirm, etc. So many dilemmas at play. There's no easy answer.
Well, except that the right to self-determination is the most important human right to protect in this context, Scott. And so if people want to stay, they have the right to stay. And why I started when I gave my talk about, like, it's our individual, like the people on the Zoom call, to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, because it's because of that we're forcing hundreds of millions of people into this situation we don't have a solution. I mean, the Peninsula Principles are awesome, but they're not being implemented for a variety of reasons. And I think one of them is what you articulated in regard to governments not wanting to step into this space because of the horrific legacy that's been left behind by what they've done in the past, well, and currently. And so, you know, it's like and why I went to the place of advocacy in the streets and also using the legal systems, either at the national or international level, for the people who have made the decision, either that they need the protection from their national government and they're not getting it, or they need the protection from their government, well, the protection of their government to stay in the places that they call home, or the protection of their government to facilitate a relocation, and the government is not doing those things intentionally, not because they actually don't have the funding to do it, which is a real issue. I mean, that's the way to move this issue forward, because it's because of all the advocacy that Indigenous peoples have done in the United States that Biden actually included a relocation assistance program in the infrastructure bill and is providing almost $100 million to create that process for very few communities, but they're gently stepping into that space because of the advocacy that Indigenous peoples in the United States have done for a really long time.
Yeah, and so it's in the Pacific level, you know, the Pacific Island Forum Declaration on the Preservation of Maritime Boundaries is groundbreaking, right? Here's a group of states saying, nah, we're preserving our baselines by reference to pre-existing baselines, and changes in the fluctuation of sea level rise doesn't change, you know, our entitlements under UNCLOS. So these are incredibly, you know, what Robin's talking about completely is happening in the Pacific. These are governments and countries and people just saying, no, we are forcing the agenda here. We are taking a positive statements. And I agree with you. Look, you know, some of those countries, their long-term outlook in terms of the preservation of land territory is bleak. But why concede that territory is just land territory, right? Who concedes that? That's a dumb legal strategy. So let's not concede that, sure. You know, and there I think once you start on that train of thought, then sort of interesting things happen. Well, I've taken up a heap of the floor, so I'm going to shut up, and I'm really sort of interested from other people who may have spoken before me or not, but anyway, I'll stop talking.
Well, you know, there's you know, I remember once, I've told this story a million times, you know, I was in the president's office, in Note Tong's office in Kiribati, and I was there with my friend Dan Lewis, and there were 3 Japanese guys that came in the room, really totally sweating, wearing 3-piece suits in the tropics, you know, like completely out of place. And I've been there, you know, a few weeks, and I've never seen these guys. I'm like, hey guys, how's it going? What are you doing here? And they go, we're selling a product. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So I thought it was like, you know, fertilizer or, you know, whatever it may be, seeds, I don't know, some products, maybe a fish processing plant, you know. And they said, do you want to see our product? And I'm like, yeah, totally. Let's see it. And they open up this really glossy portfolio, and they were selling an island. They were selling a floating island for $1 billion, a cool $1 billion. So, you know, at the time I laughed like you are, and it's, you know, it is completely unrealistic on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's never been more realistic. You know, there's all sorts of places now that are actively building floating places, right? Including, I mentioned at the beginning, you weren't here yet, but you know, the Maldives is building a whole floating city next to Hulu Male, you know, near the capital. And, you know, Holland is doing this. A number of places are doing this. So this is going to start happening more and more. And if we pursue that line, in the case of, let's say, Tuvalu, that would give them, if they put a floating series of locations on the lagoon there, they could stay probably hundreds of years, no matter how high the sea level rises, as long as the floating islands were anchored properly. But again, then it comes down to cost and all of those questions. So I think another really interesting avenue to pursue is looking at this whole cost of relocation, you know, particularly in wealthy countries. Because, you know, I was looking recently at the US, Robin, you know, what's it called? St. Jean Charles in Louisiana, that little community there. It's also indigenous, but it's a very small number of people. And the cost was like, I forget, 48 million, 100 million, like a huge figure, to move a very small number of people. And I keep coming across these massive figures to move pretty small numbers of people. So, anything that people like us, like-minded people, can do to somehow think about ways to reduce the cost and give them the same level of outcome is really going to make a big contribution, I think, because more and more, you're just going to hear the argument, we'd love to resettle them. They want to be resettled. It's on their initiative. They completely concur with the idea that they need to resettle, but it's too expensive, so we can't do it. So it's every person for themselves. Here's $500 compensation. Go find your own place to live, right? That's going to become the default option in the end. Yes, we would love to help you. We would love to find new land for you, but we don't have it. It's too expensive. So go sort it out. Here's a little bit of compensation, a little bit of loss and damage money, and off you go to, basically live impoverished for the rest of your life. So I think that's a crucial thing. And another thing just reminds me, if you see Viraj in the upper left-hand corner there, Bruce, he's also a Kiwi, and but he's in Mexico right this second, and but he lives in Berlin, so he's a true world citizen. He's a lawyer too, and he's doing several of the things related to the project we're doing this whole year on the Peninsula Principles that he's responsible for, is looking at all potential regional and international remedies that could be pursued concerning aspects of the Peninsula Principles / climate displacement which haven't been pursued yet, and then also trying to formulate sort of a model test case that could be presented specifically on the HLP rights, housing, land, and property rights dimensions held by a potential individual or group of climate displaced peoples or community, and getting that obviously recognized by a court somewhere in an advanced manner over and above that which has occurred now. So hopefully you guys can talk at some point and you can brief him on all the Kiribati stuff, the Taitiota case, and other things that.
Can I ask a question here? And I want what the cost of relocation, basically in it's sort of I guess a question for what Rick would think about this, given the points that he was making before, and Bonnie. Look, in Fiji's case, right, they're funded through a sovereign trust fund. They set up a trust fund to relocate people. And one of my jobs has been at MFAT has been to say, okay, what are the conditions for that? And we've just released a tranche. So basically SOPs, I had a role in reviewing those and all that sort of stuff, and satisfy they tick enough boxes to say, okay, good enough sort of stuff. So tranche funding, and I think community in Viti Levu is going to be the first community that's going to be relocated under these SOPs that have gone through Parliament. But it sort of got me thinking, you see, and it's sort of, and it's a model, and it's one of the leadership things of the Pacific, that they're saying, look, we need to relocate X amount of our communities, and we've done it this way. We've set up a sovereign fund to do that, and we all, all the terrible sovereign wealth funds that go around and build up, buy up all real estate and do all these horrible other things, invest in fossil fuels. But here's a sovereign fund designed to offset the costs of moving people from A to B in the context of climate change and disasters. So it got me thinking, Rick, about about whether you think there's a scale up here through the security and the peace and stability lens, of saying, look, this is obviously something, if people are left to their own devices, this is something that can be destabilizing within countries. So there's inherently a peace and security and stability thing here that sort of speaks to all the sort of big UN sort of issues and interventions at the UN level around ensuring peace and stability, and where there's sort of some sort of synergies there between using that sort of framing and language to try and use what's happening in Fiji as a way of scaling up this model of establishing wealth funds to the other countries, other states, or what have you, contribute to phrase some of the costs that Scotty was referencing. That's sort of an open question to you and to Bonnie. And
yeah, I mean, this has been fascinating. Just a couple of quick reflections. I sometimes wonder whether the Pacific experience is atypical in numerical terms or geopolitical terms. I mean, the plight of Kiribati and Tuvalu is the poster child example of climate change because it's so graphic, you know, the idea of a nation disappearing, what happens to the people. But that hasn't galvanized huge amounts of support for the Pacific Island nations globally. There are a particular phenomenon when it comes to rising sea levels that apply to small vulnerable island states, which have very small populations and important populations, important communities. But I think those things if everything else fails, if adaptation, resilience, staying put fails, then I think with good, smart regional public policy and collaboration, there are solutions. I mean, labor migration schemes, dual passports, New Zealand's experience with seasonal labor. I mean, there are more people living in Auckland than reside in most of the Pacific Island nations themselves. So, you know, if you can build bridges that people can move backwards and forwards, younger, mobile, employable parts of the community can work in Auckland or Wellington or Sydney or Melbourne, send remittances money. Older people who want to spend their last years working the taro and kumara plots and to die in the islands as part of their cultural identity should be given those rights. It's about agency. It's about giving them opportunities where the island is less and less hospitable to longer term dense population. So, you know, I don't think any of that is a question of money. I think those things with smart long-term policy, I think they're solvable. I mean, I'm reminded of what's going on in New York at the moment. There is a massive East River resilience protection scheme going on at the moment beneath the building that I live in. $1.5 billion has been committed to building these very fancy seawalls to prevent a sort of a repeat of Hurricane Sandy. So, you know, if city-states, and that's the way we're going, Scotty, with more and more populations, are able to mobilize political and financial will, tapping into the deep pockets, and there are deep pockets, clearly. I mean, the money that we're talking about is small change when you look at the global flow of resources and funding, isn't it? I mean, 1.5 billion is nothing. And yet that's the entire reclamation project, which will protect thousands and thousands of low-class people in the East River complex. You know, these are low housing areas. So, you know, it's a matter of political will. And I often wonder, you know, what is it that we're missing here? Kirsten, you remember this experience. Whenever you're left with a complex humanitarian situation, it's trying to find convergences of interest. What is it that is in the interests of other powerful stakeholders that will bring them to the table? I mean, what is it? We're not trying to, the Peninsula Principles are valuable, they're useful because they're normative and they're standard setting, but they won't sell through big business unless big business sees that there are benefits that will flow from it. You know, if you did, Scotty, your mapping of geography that's going to get inundated, I would suggest that most of the billionaires have properties that are right smack on the borders of water. And if they were shown that their real estate is going to simply disappear and that it's in their interests to take some more collective action to deal with it, then, you know, you've got some empirical evidence that feeds directly into their personal interests, you know, in Melbourne and Sydney and places like that. You know, falling cliffs in Auckland are on millionaire and billionaire properties. They want to preserve and protect. So to make the argument that those issues will affect their own bottom line, that their business interests will also be affected, I think that's key. How far the Pacific experience can be leveraged into the Sahel or Somalia, where you've got these extremely complex multitude of factors, climate change being one of them, but also horrific violence and conflict and desertification. I'm not sure whether whether it's possible, Scotty, to strip out or extrapolate some key principles that would apply to all situations, or whether it's better to adopt a more regional specific or situation specific approach and then mobilize states and resources around that. I mean, I think the Pacific is important, but I just wonder whether it's scalable and transferable to the places where the vast preponderance of mass displacements are going to take place. I mean, the great deltas of Bangladesh and Myanmar and places like that. I'm not sure. But at the bottom line, you know, there's no shortage of space to accommodate people who have no other choice but to move, and there's no shortage of financial resources to do it. It's small change. I think what's missing is this motivational convergence of bringing different stakeholders together. That may be what I was saying at the beginning. You kind of rolled your eyes a bit, Bruce, but the multilateral system might still have some last gasp legs and something like that, because that's what it can do. It can bring governments and stakeholders and businesses increasingly around the table to look at those kinds of things. Particularly if we're moving to cities, it's a different dynamic. The mayors of cities, the cosmopolitan nature of cities is far easier to deal with sometimes than federal entities, isn't it? So, I think maybe we've been looking in the wrong places. I think if you look at the US, for example, city states are becoming kind of the antidote to some rather toxic federal policies and high court policies and the Supreme Court policies. So, it's quite interesting to understand the kind of social dynamic and responsibility that goes in city states. They're not malevolent. There are a lot of very, very positive things that are going in city state. New York is a spectacular example of how it really goes to great lengths to protect all sectors of its community and provides the kind of infrastructure and investment that goes with it. It falls short, but kind of the endeavor is clearly there. So I don't know if that's helpful. The cost we're talking about, if you look at the private enterprise, I'm just looking at the value. JP Morgan has just swallowed up one of the big banks that was defaulting out of Silicon Valley. JP Morgan's book value is about $500 billion. These are, that's one company on the face of the planet. So it's not about money. It's about where we put it. And I think maybe that's probably the great dilemma with dealing with climate change globally. I know it's Guterres' frustration because some of these things are actually achievable, but as long as the levers of power are controlled by big unaccountable corporate interests that are driven by a bottom line of profit, on the assumption that we live in a world that has inexhaustible resources, then we're fucked, frankly. So we're coming back, Scotty, to that other narrative of an alternative way of managing our global economy in a way that's actually responsible to what we have. I'm sorry if I've come full circle. Maybe that's what happens when you come to the end of your professional career. But those are the kinds of questions we're grappling. We're not going to deal with climate change until we change the fundamental economic model that drives the economies of this planet.
Well, the economic model, but also the political model. I mean, this whole system of nation states, et cetera, really, the big taboo issue that we need to discuss in the context of resolving climate displacement is the whole question of nationality and the viability of, what the European Union has started with a de facto regional passport is already being discussed in the Pacific. We need to probably expand that to the world. There does need to be, it's been sought after for hundreds of years, since Socrates began speaking of being a citizen of the world, et cetera. We need to move in the direction of actually getting a passport that would enable people to live anywhere and to cross any border at any time. And it's only
like
through that,
egg, isn't it? Does the economy drive the politics, or the politics drive the economy? And I would suggest that it's the economic model and those who control it that drive the politics and the decision making.
But even The Economist, not necessarily a very lefty magazine, they are all for the erosion of borders and open borders, and they've calculated, I can't remember, I think it was this $78 trillion of economic gain is lost by the current system of visas, national passports, and impermeable borders, right? So if those were to disappear, you'd have $78 trillion more to help solve these problems that you don't have today because of protectionism and all the other things. So that's what I mean by, we really need to go as deep as we possibly can in terms of getting at the structural basis of how we decide to organize ourselves in order to address a problem which is going to ultimately affect, to one degree or another, everybody. And we can't just pretend that the status quo is going to remain the status quo. I mean, current developments in the world show that convincingly. But on this issue in particular, as that we do have enough land, but the proportion of the world's land surface which will be comfortably habitable by human beings is shrinking all the time. Some of it's gaining in the north and stuff, but a lot of it's shrinking. So we are going to have to squeeze more people into smaller places as time goes on. And, will we be prepared? Will we do it right for once? Or will we just act, in a reactionary manner as we tend to do as humans? And that, I think, we have, once again, we have all the info we need, but will we act on it remains, the question. Bonnie, your hand is up.
Just a couple of comments.
You are called on, Professor.
Not used to that. Just a couple of comments. One, well, a practical comment response to Bruce's question. I don't know if on the fund. I actually just did a paper in January looking at a comparison of 10 different trust funds in human rights, environment, and disarmament. Because the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons states parties are looking at doing a trust fund on victim assistance and environmental remediation. So we were did a comparative analysis of all those trust funds. So anyway, so there are models out there that, I mean, obviously you know that, but if you're interested in knowing more about details of how those work, I'd be happy to share it. But a lot of times they apply them, they give the money more generally to affected states or NGOs or groups rather than to specific individuals, although there are exceptions. But anyways, I have a lot of nitty gritty on that, if that's useful. The second comment was just in reaction to this idea of a convergence of interests. And I think one thing that struck me is over the years of my work, particularly in disarmament, which is obviously very peace and security, it can be peace and security related, is the importance of emphasizing the humanitarian impacts. I mean, nuclear weapons, to use an example, is about as can be as centered around national interest and security as any issue out there. And the thing that cracked the deadlock of that issue after decades of stalemate in the nuclear non-proliferation treaty format, in order to get to the treaty banning nuclear weapons, which I agree, which is not a panacea, but is a sort of has been a game changer in terms of taking a new look at the nuclear weapons issue, was this idea of framing it as a humanitarian issue, an issue that transcended national interests. So I think that's when you get around a convergence of issues, that's an important thing to keep in mind, is this idea of something that's humanitarian focused. And I've had that with other weapons I've dealt with. States are, telling me just keep the focus on the human issue, and that would certainly be applicable for climate displacement, something that affects every state and sort of transcends the national boundaries. And I guess the last point is just I echo what Bruce and Rob and others were saying about implementation is key. And I think that the Peninsula Principles you're going through the year, there'd be different ways you could take, like if you wanted to draw out, I could see different projects and whether you picked a couple principles you really wanted to delve deep into in terms of how to implement those couple principles in specific case studies, or, taking one principle and looking at it across different case studies. I mean, I could see all sorts of projects there to keep you busy, Scott, or others busy, but I think the implementation is really interesting.
So have a look at the new and improved Displacement Solutions website, which we've just kind of fully overhauled with our graphic design guys. And there you'll find also new graphically designed multilingual versions of the Peninsula Principles there. So have a look there, and please send it far and wide. So remind people, like we reminded you, that it's still there, that it's still valid, that we can still keep expanding its utility. So if you can do all that, and if you have any more ideas, we've jotted down everything, we've obviously recorded it, and we're going to put together a whole series of different multimedia things. But if any ideas pop in your mind over and above the ones you've all suggested today for little, like very mass media, or let's say social media oriented products that we're going to put out there, 12-second, 15-second little things that would really shift thinking on these questions, send all of it, and we'll try to in discussions with our media guys, try to put together the best ones. So we're going to come up with a whole series of these that can be, spread around and try to, take all the points that we've been discussing and others and present them to the, larger public in a way that they can actually do something with them. And yeah, well, we're hosting another one of these meetings in a few hours, so I need to have a little breather in between. So thank you again, everybody. And I hope you remember the Red Hill time as fondly as I do. And little did you know that I very intentionally made sure that the Peninsula Principles were adopted on a certain anniversary of a certain concert that took place in Woodstock in 1969. So that date was not arbitrary. That happened. That was very intentional. Little does anyone know, but now you do. So, but thanks again, because I loved it. That was a really fun little period, and I'm in touch with most of you still, which is great. And let's keep it going. Okay, well, everybody's here now, so let's get started. So this meeting's being recorded and stuff, and we will put we're doing a whole series of these. I mean, this is the first one of 9, or second one of 9. The first one was this morning with the other half of the Peninsula Principles crew. We had to split it into 2 chunks for time zone reasons, and then the rest are going to be regional meetings in all the main regions of the world throughout the remainder of this year to really try to get the most up-to-date kind of vanguard thinking on the whole question of climate displacement more broadly, and then the potential role of the Peninsula Principles and everything like that. So this being the 10th anniversary year, the actual anniversary is on the 18th of August, coming up soon. We thought it would be good to bring everybody together and just kind of, do a stock taking kind of exercise, see where things are at, see if you have any news and developments in the work that each of you are doing in the field of climate displacement and related things, and really like we did this morning in the initial meeting, really brainstorm and have what we had this morning was an awesome discussion for an hour or more, just bandying about ideas about kind of new innovative things that might well be tried and might well work in this field, given the fact that where we are today in 2023 is a very different place than in 2013. Like by any measure, there's not a single measure I think you could say other than new organizations being formed and greater awareness of the problem. But when you look at climate displacement and the causes, etc., the situation today is infinitely worse than it was in 2013, and it will be even far, far worse in 2033 and 2043 if things don't, change at the core. So, civil society responses to this problem have to evolve in line with, developments in the world. So one of the big changes is that positive changes clearly is that climate displacement, broadly defined, is a much more prominent issue on the global political and legal and human rights and even climate change agendas than it was 10 years ago, and certainly than 20 years ago. So people understand it more. People know of individual cases of this happening in certain countries. They're starting to learn the scale of the problem and where it will be, the worst. Individual families are starting to prepare and plan for these things at levels, never before seen. And there is broadly speaking, a much greater awareness of the problem as the situation has continued to worsen. Even here in Australia, they're starting to use this term, which they never used before, and they're putting in place all sorts of programs and projects in areas that have suffered severe climate effects in the last few years, particularly flooding in northern New South Wales and southern Queensland, where the government has pulled out literally hundreds of millions of dollars, which was completely unexpected, to basically buy people's land back from them who live in permanent floodplains. So that's just one example. I mean, there's countless others of planned, all sorts of planned relocations around the world, kind of measured in the hundreds of cases now. More and more governments addressing it structurally, more places experimenting with things like floating neighborhoods, floating homes, floating anything, floating office buildings, to sort of preempt rising sea levels, etc. So things are really progressing and evolving in that regard, but at the same time, the problem only worsens and the scale of it only worsens. And, we're still light years away from having any sort of globally effective response that can come anywhere near dealing with the scale of the problem. So, bearing all of that in mind, it would be good to hear from each of you about, what is your latest thinking on these questions? What are your various institutions doing? What's happening, on the ground in places that you either live or go to? New strategies, new tactics that may have kind of come up in addressing these things. Good examples of places where you've seen, let's just say, planned relocation work successfully, which will be small in number because it almost never does, or where people are actually getting compensation, or where people are getting a new home for a lost home, all of those types of things. So without any further ado, let's just follow the agenda order and give the floor to Ingrid for 10 minutes or less or more if she wants, just to outline what's up in Holland, what have you been personally doing, any references you want to make to the Peninsula Principles, etc. So Ingrid, take it away.
I'm actually now, since last year, we started a new research program on climate change related mobility in the borderlands, which focuses on the borderlands areas of the Bengal borderlands, the West African borderlands, and what we call the Pacific borderlands, but we didn't really have the full right term yet for that area. And it's mainly trying to foreground the perspectives of mobile and indigenous and marginalized communities in discussions of mobility and climate change, and also putting forward sort of a broader historical perspective. So for instance, in the West African borderlands, we're looking into nomadic fishery groups, nomadic pastoralist groups. But we're furthest with the case on the Pacific borderlands, focusing mostly on discussions around Tuvalu and where people are moving to and how they see their borders, etc. And that research is also to a large extent led by Carol Forbotko of Griffith University and Tekai Kitara TK, independent researcher from Tuvalu, and several other researchers also from Tuvalu are involved. So I'm here mainly presenting that because it's, I think, most clear and further mostly worked out. Basically, in doing so, I want to reflect on the question global climate displacement challenges in 2023, and mainly also whether the question in itself, if it's the right question, and what the implications are of the question. For sure, as I think all the other presentations will show, climate displacement is a very serious issue, and it has been going on and needs support and programs, and also, as we have been arguing, within the Peninsula Principles. However, what this research tries to also show is how it also has, in a way, also become a narrative of its own that can have an opposite effect, as opposed to per se ensuring people their human rights are sort of protected. that people sometimes no longer get the right to self-determine their mobility decisions in the context of climate change. And I think that's also something we've been highlighting also in the Peninsula Principles, that this self-determination should be very vital, and also the perspectives of the communities in that context as to how they want to define their climate futures also in context of mobility. So that's sort of what the presentation is on. So what this group of research has been doing is working on a plea for open climate futures. So not to always assume there will be displacement and required relocation, but to also assess a wider set of adaptation pathways with community as a central sort of decision makers. And we deem this increasingly important, as a lot of the discussions on climate change and mobility are now driven by models, predictions, and images like you see here. Please this image is just an example. I didn't fact check it, but it was just to exemplify that if you're not a modeler or climate scientist, it's sometimes very hard to engage with these images and to understand what does this mean for where I live. And then very often a sort of a narrative of uninhabitability can get imposed on the places of where you live. And it's very hard to then engage with the experts on that, of what it actually means, and also the indigenous knowledge, what role it could get in these discussions. So consequence, I'm sure several of you know that work is from Bordner et al., who did this study on the Marshall Islands. Who argued how external donors and Western media had framed several of the small island states as lost to climate change, as sort of everybody there would become the first climate refugee. But actually many also want to locally adapt in place, but then donors perceive that as unfeasible. And then that study highlighted that many people in the Marshall Islands saw these as neo-colonial dynamics that deprive the islands of state sovereignty over their adaptation strategies, and that they want to self-determine how to, how they want to engage with these climate change challenges, and also to discuss with donors in that context. So basically, we've been arguing for pluralization of climate futures, and especially also with indigenous peoples, that they want to repossess their right to self-determine their immobility and mobility in the context of global warming and other types of challenges. And claim rights to self-determine ways to adapt to climate change. And the fact that money comes from external donors should not refrain this right. And an example of that is of that narrative is also what you have seen. You probably know about that also with the Pacific Climate Warriors, this civil society group, very highly organized, to really make clear that, hey, we're not drowning, we're fighting. We want to have a say in our future and want to be taken seriously, and not just to be framed as passive victims in that context. So that is a very sort of vocal example of that. But also Tuvalu is now, the government of Tuvalu is now quite serious also in this context of thinking quite out of the box, both with thinking of how to expand and better protect particular islands with a land reclamation project, and at the same time also thinking of Plan B with a Future Now project. So in terms of Plan A, seeking to stay, they on one hand are promoting cultural values to influence other nations and peoples to think about their shared responsibility, to that we need to stop global warming because of these principles. It's also we don't have time to go into it now, but this link will get to a whole plan that they have about reclaiming and extending land so that they could stay on their islands, which they want to have more expertise and funding, etc., channeled to, as opposed to the option of, okay, what does it mean to move away? At the same time, they're also quite active of, we actually want to make our statehood and maritime borders permanent. So even if it should happen that particular islands get lost, or the whole of Tuvalu gets lost, we don't want to lose our, say, sovereignty. Also, if particular territories change, we don't want that changes officially then how much exclusive economic zones, that will also change sort of how large your sea is and where you can fish and self-determine that. So they want to make those borders permanent. So there are discussions on that. More out of the box, they have presented this perspective of a digital nation in that context of staying a nation, even should the worst case scenario happen, so that they can retain their state sovereignty. And at the same time, they want to have their maritime space maintained. And then, of course, they also highlight, but that needs to be worked out, all kind of climate mobility arrangements if there's a diaspora in different places, how they are still connected to this mobile nation, Tuvalu. So to end this presentation, I think also we need to think a bit out of the box in this sense. Sort of how can we find ways for states such as Tuvalu to retain their sovereignty in the sort of the worst case scenario, but also in the already present day scenario, how can they retain sea rights, which is also very important, not just economically, but also culturally for many of the people who are having connection, not just to the land, but also to the sea on which they base their identity. So I think that's also very important for communities in terms of what they lose and how we should protect those rights. And generally for people from endangered places to stay collective, and to think of out of the box ways in that context. All right, I'll keep it here. I hope I was in the time.
Great, thank you very much. That's really good. So
Yes.
have you been working on
Sorry, I have to get back
in
to the
Tuvalu
Zoom.
yourself, or just research from afar?
No, in case of I have been in the other places in the project, but in case of Tuvalu, my preference would actually be, because Carol and TK, they know so much, and they're gonna do the field work next fall. Also to limit my pollution, etc. The ideas that they will really lead this research, and and it's just that has been a really nice collaboration to think. I really, what I like about, well, it's a very difficult case, of course, Tuvalu. It's very, also when I hear TK and Carol speak, they're very emotionally also attached to Tuvalu, with TK being from Tuvalu and Carol and TK are a couple. So they feel very emotionally also attached to Tuvalu. And it's very hard to hear them speak about it. I also find it a hopeful case in the sense that they come up with very out of the box ideas, because for them the climate future is already there now. Whilst here in the Netherlands we sometimes have discussions about it, but it's all quite vague, and it's a very still citizens are not really discussing this so much, and it's maybe some think tanks in the Netherlands that are talking about it, but it's not really something very clear on the agenda for what climate change could mean for the Netherlands. Was there in Tuvalu, is there now, so people have to think about out of the box, and I find it quite hopeful with sort of the diversity of ideas they come up with, and I think we as an international community need to listen to that and learn from that.
Yeah, because I mean, Tuvalu is really like a classic example that shows that, you know, black and white solutions or analyses of this situation are just simply impossible. You know, it's all levels of gray, you know, but there, you know, the work that not just Tuvalu, but a lot of other Pacific Island nations are doing now to establish permanent maritime boundaries is really progressive thinking, you know, in terms of planning far ahead so that they don't, you know, kind of almost by accident lose sovereignty to a degree, you know. There's also, of course, the bigger question, the whole huge geopolitical, we talked about this morning at this morning's meeting, you know, the geopolitical significance of the Pacific now compared to just say 10 years ago when we were doing the Peninsula Principles, and before that. I mean, the whole China-US rivalry is playing itself out in this massive ocean, the world's biggest ocean, in a way that simply has never been the case before. And each one of those governments is now enduring different types of threats and different types of pressures, different types of, danglings of money from both sides, and broadly defined, both blocks. And that's putting also added pressure on these governments. And some are, clever enough to use it to their advantage. But it is creating a level of kind of, fear, paranoia, instability in a way that was not there before. I don't know what type of impact in the end it's going to have on protecting people's rights not to, suffer the scourges of rising sea levels, and at the same time be able to reestablish somewhere else, perhaps not just in a digital realm, but in a real realm too, like a new Tuvalu. We worked a lot some years ago on this idea of, which was driven by the Tuvaluans, moving the entire nation at a certain point so that they could stick together. And it's, it's only 11,000 people. So it's not 15, 16 million people in Holland or 25 million people here. It's a small number of people, but spread across 9 islands. Each island is completely different culturally, power structure wise, vis-a-vis all the other islands, etc. So it's very complicated, even though it's only 11,000 people. But there's already an island in Fiji called Kiowa, which is occupied exclusively by former Tuvaluans who moved
Yeah,
there.
we're also
50
going
years
there
ago.
for field work, indeed. But what I heard is that
Right.
that is longer ago that they made that that they went there, sort of outside of the context
Mhm.
of climate change. But we're going there indeed
Yeah.
to, because it's sometimes indeed put in certain places like a possible relocation site. So we're Carol and TK are going there for field work. To find out how people see that, and also the people there that already live there, do they feel Tuvaluans or Fiji or
Right.
how does that work in terms of identity? Do they also have to relocate to higher grounds or not? Because I think they live more on the lower side. So how does it? So but that's still to do on the to-do list for the next year.
Yeah, because I mean, we've sent people there over the years, to check the sentiments of the people on Kiowa now, and they all come from one of the 9 islands of Tuvalu. They don't come from all 9; they come from just one, and it's like coming from the Punjab, in India. They're like they're seen as like the Sikhs of India, and so the most educated, the wealthiest, the most entrepreneurial. And they think they're the best, basically, right? The bottom line is they're not particularly welcoming of the people living in Tuvalu now. You would presume that because they're Tuvaluan, oh yeah, come on, hang out with us on Kiowa, everything will be good. We'll create Tuvalu 2.0, but it's not that simple. And it's not,
exactly.
and that's just the first issue. And then beyond that, the economics of it, the logistics of it, the fact that it's in a third country that hasn't necessarily given them permission, and then obviously just the complexity of abandoning your country en masse. It's never really happened before. So so a lot of things look good on paper, but then you start looking at it in real life and it's not that good. So but that's great. That's a great project that you're doing. That's fantastic. So let's then move on to Shah Jahan Bhai. Let's hear the good news from Bangladesh. So many good things to report. Come on.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott Bhai, for introduction, and let me give the permission to present our program. And first of all, I would like to thank Displacement Solution to introduce the word displacement in Bangladesh in 2011. When actually nobody talking about the displacement issues in Bangladesh, and everybody talking about the climate refugee. So till 2012, we have been working with the displacement solution, and we have conducted many works in the national level and the local level. And now you will find in the many places in government documents, displacement, they are using the displacement word. So you will find more progress in my next slide. So today I want to actually share our experience on the displacement challenges, progress so far globally and country level, and what is the way forward. So this is already known by all actually, but as there is a title, so key challenges in the global level. So, and the latest UNHCR says that in the COP27, the climate crisis is the human crisis. It is driving displacement, make life harder for those already forced to flee. And in the IPCC 6 report, they have recognizes that the climate change as a several multidimensional factor contribute to post displacement. And in Bangladesh, and recent flood in Bangladesh in the northeastern part of Bangladesh displaced 480,000 people. And each year, Bangladesh coastal erosion or the river erosion despairing land 3,000 hectares per year and approximately displacing 25,000 people in the annually. So this is the synopsis of the global and Bangladesh, what is happening. And what progress actually be the government progress, Bangladesh government initiative to deal with the displacement, for displacement. So you can see here is the some progress of Bangladesh government, which is the result of the long advocacy of the civil society organization and the meeting and capacity building effort by the different organizations in Bangladesh. So first thing you can see that the national strategy on displacement and climate induced internal displacement which is approved in the 2021 and followed by the national action plan on internal displacement. This action plan is for the 2022 to 2042. This is already finalized. So this during development of the strategy, they have, I would say that they fully follow the Peninsula Principle, and they have used the definition. They have all the right-based approach and legal issues and right-based move. Everything they have followed in this documentation, and which is reflected in this strategy. And recently, Bangladesh government also developed the Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan. So this is also focusing on the mostly climatic focus, how they can actually want to develop, want to be a developed country in the 2041, considering the climate issue as priority basis. And recently, Bangladesh government also developed the National Adaptation Plan of Bangladesh, which is for the 2023 to 2050. You know that in 2018, Bangladesh government have the Delta Plan called 2100. Perspective Plan for 2020. This is also the focus on the climate change issues, and they have Bangladesh government also updated the standing order on the disaster in 2019. And more significant is in the budgetary allocation in the national budget is almost double than the 2015 to 16 to 2021 to 2022. So which was in the 1.44 billion, and this is now the 2.96 billion in the Bangladesh budget. So, and Bangladesh government now receiving some fund from the GCF, Global Green Climate Fund, so through the NDA, and this support is the $368.6 million for the 6 projects. So what is the global level progress? So you all know that in the COP26, Scotland government declared that $2 million for the first ever time as a way to encourage other countries to follow. And it is very much fortunate for us, and we are very much thankful to the CGRF. And a part of the fund of the Scotland fund we have already received in Bangladesh through CGRF. And this is the IPSHA implementing project with this fund in Bangladesh. And in COP27, you know that there is a significant decision made to set up the loss and damage fund. As I am highlighting here the loss and damage, because the displacement issue now discussing under the loss and damage. So all the loss and damage issue come here in our discussion today. And with the way to Scotland, there is some more government come forward with the declaration of some funding for the loss and damage in the COP27, and these are the Denmark, Belgium, Germany, Scotland, and Australia, obviously. So they have already declared from their own, so that they want to do something for loss and damage for the developing countries. And over this time, we have observed that CSO has been very much vibrant to pressure the developed countries and the different stakeholders for the climate justice issue, particularly on the loss and damage issues. And this and if recent engagement, I want to share some of our recent engagement, and you will be happy to know that there is some process ahead of the SB 58 and the COP 28. So non-economic loss and damage losses. There is a technical paper developed in the 2013 by the Warsaw International Mechanism of the Executive Committee, but now they are thinking to update it, and they sought support from the platform of the disaster displacement, and through CGRF platform and disaster displacement communicate with us, and we have shared our case stories, and it is reflected in the submission, and already which is submission to the Secretariat. And another grassroots learning shared through Climate Justice Resilient Fund, which is to the Technical Committee on the Loss and Damage Fund, because they are now thinking to develop the mechanism of the funding mechanism of the Loss and Damage Fund. And there was a meeting in the 29th and 30th. Before the meeting, grassroots lesson learned was submitted by the CGRF, and our lessons from the Bangladesh, we have a part of this. We have shared our lessons from the grassroots. And in the first ever time in Bangladesh, there was a submission from the civil society on the climate change and human rights issues for the upcoming universal periodic review for the fourth cycle. So this is the first ever time from Bangladesh we have submitted the climate change and human rights issue from here, and which is already been submitted. And in the meantime, we have published articles, different articles and interviews in international media, including the Alliance magazine and the Climate Home News. And we have been participating regularly in international webinars, including the locally related adaptation community of practice organized by the World Resource Institute and Alliance magazine. We have been participating in the Conference of Parties since 2018 and conducting the regular side event, joint side event with other organizations, like-minded organizations. And then recently we have enrolled our representation in the different national and international forum and network, mentioning some of the, such as the Climate Action Network South Asia, active member of the Displacement Management Cluster in Bangladesh. We are the active member working since the 2000. And we are the member of the CGRF Loss and Damage Advisory and Advocacy Board. And we are also the part of the Climate Justice Just Transition Donor Collaborative in this initiative. And there is a, how can I explain? This is the, there is a document where all the relevant donor and the grassroots national organization and the NGO and CSO individual organization databases, these are in this database. Recently, we have conducted one survey. I want to present here the some grassroots reality of the climate for displacement. In the two weathers in the southeastern coast in Bangladesh, there is some key findings, and we have found that the cyclone, coastal erosion, and the floods are the major causes of the climate for displacement. And already there is a 15,000 people living in temporary settings, like as the embankment site, road site in the 3 districts of the Bangladesh, 3 sub-districts of the Bangladesh. And we call them the trapped people. They don't have the capacity to move, to migrate, and they don't have to buy the land or to construct the house. So they are living in the very much temporary settings. So among these displaced people, 70% household experience 2 times or more time displacement over this period. And 50% displaced people, they have to force to leave their occupation, change their occupation. And because they are living in the temporary setting, so their water and sanitation situation is very poor. And we have found that the 95% families are using the unhygienic, poor condition of latrine. And 68% people, displaced people, they want to relocate within this territory. In this, that means that within this union. And as per the proposal, there is a scope to work for this trapped people and the migrated people. Those are actually migrating to the urban area, particularly in the slum area. So I have some proposal for the IFSHA and DS, what we can do in the near future through the different project intervention. We can do the advocacy with the duty bearer at the point of origin and the point of destination. We can form the community team comprising with the displaced community and build their capacity so that they can claim their rights. Engaging youth to work as a change agent, because they are very much, we have, through our experience, we have seen that the young people have very much potential to create the pressure to the duty bearer on behalf of the big vulnerable population. And campaign through the community team and the youth, also we can ensure the accessing of displaced people to the government different social safety net program. And we can provide alternative livelihood training. This is very much effective, we found over this year. And if we can provide the alternative training, and they can, particularly to the women, they can contribute to their family and they can live better than before. And because their housing condition is very poor, if we cannot provide the housing through the relocation for the all people, but those are living in the temporary setting, we can provide some housing materials or the different types of materials so that they can build a moderately better housing for them. And obviously, one house, one family at a time program, we can continue with this, and we can call them the community plan relocation as a durable solutions. And we have continuing one initiative in the national level with the like-minded different organization. We call it the CSOs initiative in the national level, CSOs for the climate justice. So we want to continue with this, and we are giving the pressure, or we are building the capacity of the government and providing the some need-based support and information to the government negotiation team so that they can do better negotiation in the international field. So this is our approach. I want to highlight one of our approach here. So particularly, we have divided in our work in majorly in the two parts. One is the supply side, another in the demand side. Demand side means why are actually demand of the displaced communities. So, and supply side is those are the responsible to do for the displaced communities. They are the supply side. I mean the local government, local administration, the government entity are the supply side people, and the displaced community and the surrounding community, they are the demand side. So we can build their capacity of the displaced community so that they can claim their rights, as well as we can ensure their alternative livelihood and other sorts of needs and rights so that they can live better and live in the permanent housing and with durable solutions. And in the supply side, we can do advocacy and campaign with the duty bearers, particularly the government, so they can come forward to the displaced communities. And through this way, we have seen that displaced community can live better, because there is some sorts of services in the government hand, but the displaced community don't know. We are on one side, we are giving the message to the displaced community, use services here, and on the other side, we are giving pressure, we are motivating the government authority that should come forward with the displaced community need. And so both supply side and demand side, we are working, and we are continuing our work in the plan relocation. That is the one house, one family at a time in the different modality. So this is our approach. And about the funding, as I mentioned, in some countries already come forward with some funding for the loss and damage. So I want to give this information here. Denmark already offered $13 million for the loss and damage for the developing country. Belgium pleased to allocate 2.5 million euros. Germany 170 million euros. Scotland additional 5 million pounds. And Australia at 50 million euros to tackle loss and damage for the next 4 years. So besides, there is a different philanthropic, we can start funding from them. Particularly, I would highlight here the Climate Justice Just Transition Donor Collaborative. This is the initiative of the 6 donors, but there is many other donors, they are already included with this initiative. So I think this is the one of the best option to source their funding from this collaboration. So this is from my part. So let's ensure the new home land for lost land, new home for lost home for the climate displaced people. Thank you very much for your question.
Great job, Shah Jahan Bhai. That was very good, very thorough. You guys are still as busy as ever. Good to see. And I think, you know, of all the countries in the world that used the Peninsula Principles actively to develop national internal displacement policies, I think Bangladesh has turned out to be #1. You know, and a whole bunch of different countries did use them in differing ways, but I think, as you said, you know, the national internal displacement strategy follows the principles, you know, item by item, essentially. So that was a real victory. And you mentioned the One House, One Family at a Time program that we do jointly together, DS and IPSA. And we should say here that we're just about to finalize the agreement for phase 3, right? Is phase 3, right? Yeah.
Yes.
The third group of houses that we basically raise money internationally, and then we send it to IPSA, and IPSA arranges to build houses for climate displaced families. And we're up to 14 houses now. Is that right? I think. Is that right, Shah Jahan Bhai?
Yes, including phase 3, there will be the 14 houses.
Yeah, including, yeah, so 14 houses, and so which then basically are, you know, become the property of IPSA, and then IPSA provides them free of charge to extremely vulnerable climate displaced families in different parts of the country. So we'll soon be starting on phase 4, where we'll shoot for a target of 30 new houses. So free homes
Inshallah.
for inshallah. You know, free houses for a few hundred people. You know, a drop in the bucket, but at least, you know, at least it's something. And we're extremely grateful for all the hard work that IPSA does on this issue broadly, and that you continue to do it in such a good way is really admirable. So, you know, thank you again for all the great work you do at IPSA. And again, send our best wishes to Arif Bhai for a speedy recovery. So thank you very much. And please send us those, send us an email with that presentation, and you too, Ingrid, if you can, just so we have those materials, because they're really greatly appreciated from both of you. So now let's move to Khalid, Haseen.
Wisdom. No, first let me start to thank you, Scott, Kirsten, and Viraj, and Sean, and all the colleagues for organizing this commemoration of the 10-year Peninsula Principles. I think it's really important to mark also this period, and to take stock. I'm here. I have two functions, so to say, where I can draw on a few thoughts that I would like to share in this context. One is due to the publication on handling climate displacement. I'm still a research associate with the University of Vienna, and do occasional lecturing, and I'm in a habilitation process there. Hence, I have encounters, meetings, and interactions with the research community there, and there are a few thoughts that I would like to share from this ecosystem, the research ecosystem. And then there is also, in my current function, the human rights ecosystem, and I'm advising the High Commissioner on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And in this context, I occasionally come into contact with climate displacement and housing, land, and property rights, and how to protect these human rights in practice. And one thing that I would like to outline, the importance of civil society and IPSA. IPSA has been really crucial in sharing experiences, good practices, and feeding into the human rights ecosystem. And I think the latest visit of the independent expert on the enjoyment of all human rights by older persons was in part supported by IPSA. And the issue of specific older persons protection in the context of climate displacement has been addressed and brought forward and discussed. And it's one of the special rapporteurs, along with other mechanisms, who are acknowledging the Peninsula principles as a tool developed and brought forward by civil society. So again, kudos on this, because from Geneva, on a global level, we always need this feedback and the expertise on the ground, so as to address and feed the regulatory framework also with concrete recommendations and progress. I was always wondering why the Peninsula Principles, which identify potential scenarios and key drivers, why, and they are translating actually what is required and now called strategic foresight, why in terms of global advocacy within the climate change movement, it hasn't taken off as it should have been, and why it is so difficult to have climate displacement specifically advocated for. And in discussions, what transpired always was that basically there is a focus on mitigation, the reduction of greenhouse gas, renewable energies, and the prevention of climate change from happening now is kind of a priority that seems to make it difficult to reach out to other constituencies and to make the case for specifically address of climate displacement, because there we are talking about adaptation. And I think something that I found out is that really it seems that there is a communication contradiction between mitigation and adaptation. If we are addressing climate displacement now, then we need to think about how to react to climate change, which is happening now, acknowledging, or there is the fear of acknowledging that we are losing ground on mitigation. So for me, that there was, in terms of interaction, an obstacle that I have identified, and that also many were bringing forward in one form or another, which leads me directly to how we can address it, because what we have managed is to have a tool, a civil society tool. Grassroots organizations are applying it. We have more than pilot cases where we can show actually the effectiveness of a solution, and it's more at times more than a solution pathway. So for me, when I'm trying to enlarge and not just to preach to the converted, so to enlarge the constituency, for me the reasons that I try to address also in the context with the University of Vienna was how we can bring about more clarity, that climate displacement is not just sudden but slow onset. That this constant negation also in the scientific community of causality, or even like discussing causality, could be overcome, and that that basically we need to see how we can conceptualize advocacy strategies that are evidence-based, that overcome also these two blocks of mitigation and adaptation in the climate change discourse. Of course, there has been a development of overcoming even climate change as a distinct discourse and having the human rights approach integrated, but it took 2 decades, and now still it's not something that has been embraced by all stakeholders. And then something which I saw also in negotiations when it comes to resolutions in the Human Rights Council or at the General Assembly, that there is also the impression mitigation, we focus on the global north, and adaptation is something on the global south. So these are also divisions that are underlying and that need, required to be addressed, taken into account and addressed when advocacy strategies, new advocacy strategies that are addressing the current situation are to be developed, and to have this uneven or asymmetric rapport de force between global north and south addressed, so that we ultimately can draw on this protection imperative that the Peninsula Principles are stipulating, and that they are providing solutions for, and addressees really having local authorities, and IPSA is bringing great evidence. Whenever we talk about evidence-based decision making, IPSA is a go-to organization, DS of course, but this is something that is needed and required, not only at the intergovernmental level, but also in the scientific community. At least what I have seen, but colleagues might be better placed, is that a lot of input from the ground really is required to have a discussion that is where everybody is on the same page. But what I witnessed, and I don't know whether it is representative, that the threshold for action from the local authorities to the region and then the central government, that there is, it's not always clear when we can expect action, and that the evidence provided by us ultimately is acted upon. So and finally, one important point in light of the events in Sudan is the labeling issue, I would call it. That there is the definition of when it is conflict induced and climate induced, and when we analyze a conflict, that a more in-depth linkage analysis is conducted, that we go for instance beyond the ethnic embodiment of a conflict, but to look if pastoral routes have changed due to climate change or because there is water scarcity, that we have this shared at the global level, and that at the intergovernmental fora or at the UN, this analysis is brought forward, because that would help to address situations in a more informed manner, and evidence can be shared and brought about by civil society. Another aspect where this expertise is needed. And I'll stop here. I had a point on strategic litigation that I just want to point you to the two decisions by the Human Rights Committee. It's something that contributes to evidence, and these decisions or the judgments are helping policymakers to do the necessary and be informed while suggesting or doing taking decisions on relevant policies. Thanks a lot.
Great job, man. Thank you very much, Khalid. Now, so, you work for OHCHR, so, we can talk about this later, but I mean, if we wanted OHCHR to do the most powerful thing it could do to support both the principles as principles, but the contents of the principles in particular, let's just say on the day of the anniversary of the Peninsula Principles on the 18th of August, where should we put our energy? Because I think it would be really excellent. We're trying to get a number of high-level statements kind of supporting the principles and their contents that will come out in a little film clip around that time. And I should say, by the way, that we're producing like 15 really short little films, like really short 15-20 second type, almost like ads, in the coming months. It's already well underway. We're producing between 5 and 7 minute YouTube videos on different aspects of climate displacement. We're also producing like a feature film with talking to a major director tomorrow who's won two Academy Award nominations, etc., on documentary, on the documentary category. So we're still selecting the director, but we've been in touch with several pretty major directors. So we're really trying to put out there a whole new take on this question, so not at a sort of popular mass media level. So any input you guys can give on that too would be great, because we don't want to just produce and we're talking about at least either a 49-minute film or an hour-and-a-half film, like a major film. Just might even be just with actors and stuff, not a documentary at all. But something that presents the issue in a completely unique and original way that will grab the public in a way that seeing flooded streets and people wading up to their necks in water doesn't do anymore, because people are totally tuning out to that. It's just happening so much in so many places. I mean, 33 million people affected in Pakistan, right? Recently with the floods. When's the last time you heard about that in the news? They're still suffering along. It got major coverage for about 3 hours, the day that it kind of happened. And then after that, a little bit, but by and large, people have forgotten. And that's tens of millions of people. So people are turning off to that. So what can we put out there that sort of approaches it from a unique enough angle that it would grab sectors of society's interest that isn't there yet? So we have 101 ideas, and we've been discussing everything from being able to film from like kind of like those Chinese balloons, the famous balloons that got shot down recently. One of the filmmakers has connections with these guys that have these balloons that go outside of the atmosphere of Earth, right? And they can actually film the layer of atmosphere around the Earth and stuff in a way that's never been done before, apparently. So using that sort of technology to really show basically the finite nature of the planet on which we live, right? And how it's it's not getting any bigger. We're not going to be saved by anyone but ourselves, and it's sort of time to do it. And we have other ideas. One idea is focusing on just 3 families, and each family lives in a house, obviously, but when family 1 opens the door, they're actually in the area of family 2, right? And then family 2 does their thing, and then they kind of go into their office building, and then they're actually entering the world of family 3, and it just keeps looping around to show that even though it looks different and it feels different, what climate displacement family number 1 in Bangladesh is experiencing is not that different in the end from what the indigenous person in Panama is experiencing, or the person in, some Western country who's also being threatened with the loss of their home. But so any ideas or that doesn't have to be now, but anything that you come up with, hey, that would be a cool idea for a movie, just send it on and we'll sort of weave it into the production process. So back to the original question, what should we shoot for, man, at the OHCHR level to get maximum output by them to a re-emphasis on this topic?
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I mean, it's like I'm just thinking about this idea having short videos, and in preparing this meeting, I just tried to see how much the press release of the Human Rights Committee on this decision Billy against Australia was picked up, and there was very, very little reception, let me say, or analysis about a really important decision that affirms the obligation of governments really to take appropriate measures to protect those. And if this decision would be known a bit more, that all the groups need adequate protection ensured by the government, be it at the local or central or regional level, that this is not sufficiently known, and the whole human rights machinery or ecosystem hasn't simply the resources to do more PR. I think that is something that would help also beyond strategic litigation, because it's also strategic communication, I would say, and judges, lawyers need to know about this decision, and the legal reason would help them also in their respective work. So that would be one thing. The like in terms of strategy, I think that the comparative advantage, or the huge asset of the Peninsula Principles, is that it is a civil society initiative, and that it comes from climate affected populations. That it's an initiative that is not just finger pointing or doing advocacy in the classical sense of raising awareness about a problem. No, it goes beyond that. It provides solution pathways, and we have examples how this can be addressed. And I think one really effective way or means are the mandates, the special rapporteurs, the independent experts, those mandates who do address vulnerable populations, groups, that they know that there are a high number of dedicated reports, be it on older persons, be it on migrants, be it on IDPs, be it on indigenous peoples. So I think to share this and give also the evidence from the ground, I would say, would help them in having also actionable recommendations that would help the constructive dialogue with member states or governments, and ultimately this can be picked up by other states. And to overcome, I mean, the Human Rights Council is a very unique intergovernmental forum for dialogue, where different governments, states can have that exchange, and then having the universal periodic review as a one peer review among states, where for instance, if Bangladesh is happy to share its experience and its good practice, there would be a means to share and ultimately reach progress on this front. I think that is important. And in OHHR is also the custodian of the human rights treaties. So for that, when decisions are under deliberation, I think also treaty body member experts are always welcoming support from civil society, from academia, and I just saw a call for input from the Special Rapporteur on Climate Change, and I saw that there was something on DS and handling climate displacement. So you can see that a researcher submitted something, an input that was taken into account, where the researcher referred to, I would say, our book on handling climate displacement and IPSA and DS's work. So that's and it's no, I feel embarrassed, but it's a way
that's
that
it's the intention.
And I trust that we have a new High Commissioner. He's just 6 months in office, but what he has shown already is leadership in cooperating with the mechanisms and working with the rapporteurs and all the other mechanisms. And ultimately that would be also a way to support him in discharging his mandate. I would stop here.
Okay. Do you know if Ian Fry has mentioned specifically the Peninsula Principles in any of his reports or speeches or anything yet?
I haven't seen the report yet on the subject matter. So I just saw the call for input. And I saw here and there that we were mentioned, but yeah, you know that in the past, and also thanks really to IPSA, that on different mandates, Peninsula Principles were always referred to in conjunction with other software law tools or instruments. And I think yeah, more could be done on that in that context.
Okay, great. Because one of the many other concrete projects coming out of this Peninsula Principles at 10 project that we're doing is going to be a new book on the very last word on the Peninsula Principles thus far. So we're really trying, we made a stab at it in the background document that we sent to all of you in terms of just giving us a flavor of where the Peninsula Principles have been used, mentioned, inspirational, etc. But we're trying to get as comprehensive a picture as we can. So anything, and the guy that's working on that is called Sean Buta, and we've worked with him a lot. He's a big HLP expert. And he's doing a whole series of position papers and background papers, as is Viraj, by the way, more on the legal side. Viraj's are. But if you can help us with, maybe I can put Sean in touch with you, Khaled, and you can just discuss, every single thing that about where the principles have been mentioned, whether it's a UN document number, etc. That would be really, really great. So thank you very much, Khaled. And now now that I've started a trend of holding up books, check out this little bit of history, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, yeah, look at that. Can you imagine who put that together? The next speaker and myself, not 10 years ago, but 14 years ago, Zeke. So look how thick that baby is. I've still got 5 copies if you want more. And that was that picture on the cover taken by the next speaker. There you go. But anyway, I give the floor to the mighty Zeke from the IFRC.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks also, Kirsten. Thanks, Viraj, for putting this together. It really is a pleasure to be here online, sadly. Scott, you said it was 10,000 meals ago, maybe 12,000 meals ago, but it honestly feels like yesterday, or so clear in my mind, to be sitting in Red Hill with that clear and clean and fresh air, quite cold, actually, with a group of people. I guess half of the people are here, maybe slightly less than half of the people, who were committed to trying to make a change and trying to make a difference in a new and innovative way on an issue that continues to be critical, it continues to be defining, and at its heart, it continues to be incredibly complex. So even though, Scott, you say it's 10 years ago, it's 10,000 meals, it honestly, I remember that moment extremely vividly in my mind. I remember the red wax on the organic bananas. I remember Khaled upgrading himself with a glass of champagne on his Emirates flight. All of the details are extremely clear in my mind. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the initiative. It's actually quite a good kind of prompt or motivation to think about the progress we may or may not have made over the last 10 years. And so, Scott, as you say, I've now sold out and I work for the IFRC as the global lead on migration and displacement here in Geneva, in Switzerland. But over the last 10 years, I've also been a member of the task force on displacement, which was set up under the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, connected to the Paris Agreement, etc. I've been involved in a number of COPs, where, as Shahad Jinbai mentioned, the issue is now being seen squarely as an issue of loss and damage, rightly or wrongly. But the loss and damage and climate displacement conversation is very prominent in COP now. We have a new global normative framework, the Global Compact on Migration, which squarely addresses and gives a series of commitments to states on how to address climate-related migration. We have another new global normative framework, the Global Compact on Refugees, which also grapples with this issue and addresses it and lands it less squarely. So I was thinking maybe most useful is just to reflect a little bit, and thanks for the motivation, on some of the major developments or reflections that I have over the last 10 years, Scott, Kirsten, and Viraj. And the first is, as you mentioned at the start, Scott, we've seen a major shift in the narrative and the attitude towards this issue. And I say that because for a long time, whenever climate displacement was discussed, it was very much framed as an issue for the future, something we need to grapple with by 2050 or even by 2100, an issue basically, in other words, that needed to be dealt with by future generations. And I think unsaid that this is not an issue for us. This is something for 50 or 100 years, and we can start to think about it today, perhaps. But that is changed. It's clear now that this reality is hitting us today. This is an issue for our generation. This is not something to pass on to future generations. As you said, Scott, we are and continue to see people displaced around the world today. This is not something that might happen in 50 years or 100 years' time. And that reality that people are already affected and we need to grapple with this issue immediately was a reality that was at the front and center of the Peninsula Principles 10 years ago. That need to focus on the immediacy of action, the immediacy of states fulfilling their responsibility, and as Khaled said, pre-existing responsibilities, not creating a new set of responsibilities, of community-led action. And that is a reality that the world has slowly but surely caught up to today, 10 years later. And I think in part, it is not just because of that prescience of the Peninsula Principles, but because we are all seeing that the impacts of climate change today are outpacing the modeling across the world. And it is getting to the point where it is physically and humanly impossible to ignore. So that is the first reflection I have after 10 years. The second reflection I had was that there has also been a major shift to recognize that, yes, we do indeed need to focus on people who are displaced within their own countries. In the language of the Peninsula Principles, I think it was Rick who came up with it, within states. And that was really a major coup of the Peninsula Principles at the time, when the world, when Geneva, when New York, when people around the world were really focusing on climate refugees, people crossing borders, the legal normative protection gap for people crossing borders. And again, with really the unsaid focus on this anticipated risk of floods of refugees coming from the global south to the global north. And the Peninsula Principles very squarely changed that narrative and said, this is part of it, but the real focus of action, responsibility, investment needs to be on communities who are at risk today, and those communities are by and large staying within their own countries. And at the time, we should not forget that was a major coup of the Peninsula Principles. We still see that narrative from time to time. There's a meeting taking place, I think, next week or the week after in Sweden about climate refugees coming to Europe. We still see the associated security narrative, but by and large, the world has moved on a long way to where the Peninsula Principles were 10 years ago. The need to better understand local risk, community-led assessments, build resilience, plans and strategies that fundamentally enable migration or displacement to be a choice and not a necessity for communities, and a dignified choice for communities. So that was the second reflection I had. The third is that, I think you said this at the start, Scott, but I think it's really worth emphasizing, is this challenge has, in a way, become more complex over the last 10 years. And when we're trying to design solutions to this challenge, we really need to understand what is the specific problem that we are trying to solve. And this problem is extremely complex. There is not one type of climate migrant. There is not one type of climate displaced person around the world. The impacts that we are seeing on individuals, on individual communities, are very much driven by a very specific context in which those individuals and communities are in. And so, as you say, Scott, the solution for communities in Pacific Islands will be completely different than solutions for communities who are exposed in South Asian deltas or in the Sahel or other regions of the world. And again, even within regions and within countries, the solutions will not be the same. Within one Pacific island, we might see completely different solutions for different communities within that one island, within that one country. Something building on that complexity that we've seen over the last 10 years is really the impacting of compounding risks for communities, where many of the most at-risk communities from climate are also now at risk from conflict, new, old, and protracted conflict, health, socioeconomic risks, and even, lest we forget, over the past years, the socioeconomic fallout of COVID-19 and the ability and inability of people to move connected to restrictions of COVID-19. And so, for example, we are doing work in Honduras through the Honduran Red Cross, and we're talking to a number of people who are joining the migrant caravans. And a number of them said that, for example, climate risk, hurricanes Eta and Iota were kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. That was the tipping point of why they decided to join that migrant caravan. But that their decision was also in the context of poverty, marginalization, and opportunity. So fundamentally, those people joining those migrant caravans were on the basis of those push, pull, opportunity, risk factors, making the best decision that they could in the circumstances for themselves and their families. And so that's a little bit of a challenge when we're talking about climate displacement, is how do we have front and center the compounding and complex situations in which people are making decisions and the risks and vulnerabilities that they are facing at their individual community level. And then finally, and I think, again, the Peninsula Principles were extremely prescient in identifying this at the center, is that we are seeing people moving, we are seeing communities at risk, and we are seeing that this is not an even issue. This is a deeply unequal issue. The most affected are clearly the communities who were already marginalized, those who were already excluded, those who were the poorest and already the most vulnerable. And it is many, many communities around the world that will be affected, but for us, it is really those communities who really need to be at the center of our global attention when designing solutions and investing in those solutions. And again, a critical way of making sure that happens is making sure that those same communities are at the center of designing solutions for their communities. And again, as Khaled said, a very, very prescient element of the Peninsula principles. It cannot be a top-down initiative. And then maybe finally, food for thought. Scott, I know you've been asking a lot of questions, but a question, I think a tension that we face where we sit as global people working on this issue, as national people working on this issue, as a Geneva community working on this issue, is that we have this tension between these two tracks. And one of the tracks is what we are pursuing, which is the practical, the pragmatic, the politically palatable track of trying to get a line in a COP decision about the impact of displacement, about trying to make sure that there's a paragraph in a national adaptation plan, and really a slow but hopefully sure way of centralizing this issue on the one hand, which is a big, heavy concerted effort by many organizations and individuals. But on the other hand, a recognition, a reality that that approach is completely insufficient. And we need to do something much, much more radical. And I'm sure as many of you are asked to speak to young people, to students, to people who are looking into this issue, when I describe this kind of practical, pragmatic, politically palatable track, they just look at me and say that is completely insufficient. That is not the solution that we need for a challenge that is way, way beyond trying to get a line in a COP decision. So those 2 points I think are a little bit under tension. They can of course exist in parallel, but I think, anyway, back to you, Scott. I'm getting kicked out of this room, so I'm gonna walk up, so you'll lose me for maybe 60 seconds, but I can pass back to you as I get evicted from this meeting room.
Well, thank you very much. Those were great reflections and very insightful. Just in terms of the, you know, how does climate displacement work play itself out in IFRC these days? That's kind of the general question. So what, you know, because IFRC, given the nature of its mandate and everything, obviously is, you know, what is it? The world's biggest or almost biggest humanitarian agency with representation in every country in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And so how, you know, how extensive is it? Because, you know, I used to work there, you know, God bless his soul, Graham Saunders, you know, who used to work at IFRC, used to work with him a lot, you know, until he tragically died a few years ago. And, you know, he was kind of alone in the agency. This is before you ever worked there, in terms of pushing generally for HLP rights within the context of IFRC's work, but in particular on the climate front. So, you know, how does it play itself out on a sort of daily basis? That's like really interesting to me. How extensive is it now within the mandate of the agency in terms of how it's implemented?
Yeah, big question. So I think a few elements. One is, like you said, Scott, we are a humanitarian organization, a network actually, of 192 national Red Cross or Red Crescent societies. So almost every country on earth. It's a bit of a good game to know which country does not have a Red Cross or a Red Crescent society. Less than 10, I think, but there's 192. And so we're a humanitarian network that does a lot of different things, but we have just developed a new 10-year strategy for all 192 national societies, and for us as the IFRC, the kind of like representative body, the international organization and the secretariat for all of those local organizations. And that new 10-year strategy identifies 5 things that we want to focus on for the next decade. And one of them is climate, and another one is migration and displacement. And both of those 10-year strategic priorities for the organization recognize climate-related migration and displacement at the very heart of what we need to invest in for the next 10 years. So in a way, at the highest levels, the strategic direction of the global network, it is recognized that this is something we need to invest in and respond in. I mean, I think something, you know, that like maybe I just deal with on a daily basis, but that is different about IFRC than other organizations working on this issue, is that at our heart, we are operational. Like we can have an advocacy message, we can have a policy message, we can turn up in global forum, but ultimately what we do is we work through 15 million volunteers around the world and staff at local community level, and not just the national level, but very, very, very local level. And so a lot of what we're doing is trying to bridge that gap between having an effective and principled policy message at COP, for the global compacts, for the midterm review of the Sendai framework, which is taking place in New York right now, and getting displacement language in there, with the actual action of national societies at scale. And so one of the ways we are looking to do that this year is we have a global program on climate resilience. And one of the pillars of that program is on climate-related displacement. And we have 55 countries that want to do action on that. So we will enter a process this year of basically articulating, what does that action look like? If you have a volunteer who is dedicated and committed and working at their community level and sleeping with their Red Cross or Red Crescent vest right next to their pillow, what do you want that person to do differently tomorrow at scale about this issue? And so one of the pillars will be on what is the action that national societies, that staff, that volunteers can take across some of the most affected countries on earth. What capacity do we need to bring to support those national societies to be able to address this issue? And what kind of evidence base and insights can we gather from the work of national societies in 50, 55 plus countries at a very local level, at a branch level, to influence a little bit the global policy and normative direction. So that's a little bit where it sits for us at the moment. HLP, I mean, less clear, but on that issue, more clear.
Has IFRC ever been involved in sort of a, you know, a planned relocation because of climate change effects, or is it always just responsive following a disaster?
Yeah, so I mean, the bulk of what we do is like the first 3 months after a mega disaster. And that's where a lot of the attention is, that's where a lot of the money is, that's where a lot of the resources goes, that's where a lot of the communications goes. You know, the CNN moment, where we are there at and able to scale up pretty quickly in a mega event. That said, a lot of national societies have been engaged in planned relocation, particularly in Asia Pacific. We have a new report out that looks at the engagement of national societies in planned relocation, drafted by another core member of the Peninsula Principles team, the only member that is, as announced in Red Hill, 1/4 Chinese, Bruce Burson. And so yes. He helped us put together that report on what is the experience of national societies in planned relocation. Basically, what is the pressure that national societies are under to relocate communities? Has it gone well? Has it gone poorly? And what is some guidance on them making it basically a decision on engaging or not? The bulk of those relocations have happened after mega disaster events. So Typhoon Haiyan, Typhoon Yolanda, the tsunami, etc. And often it's not necessarily because of a sophisticated climate risk analysis, but because of other factors that are driving the relocation.
Now, what about the last question I was going to ask? What's the latest on the task force? Like, how far did it actually get? Is it still ongoing? What's the goal? What's the latest goal? Like, where's it at these days?
It's still ongoing. It's had different phases and different work plans. The first phase was, in a way, probably the most effective, which was a consolidation of all of the existing work that a number of agencies had basically done on this issue, including the work of DS. And an identification within the task force and with a broader stakeholder group. So there was like a wider stakeholder group of, I think, 100 organizations that came to Geneva to support the work of the task force. An identification of like, where are the gaps in understanding and knowledge and analysis on this issue. And then basically the task force commissioned and in a way supervised the work to develop some new products looking at, for example, slow onset effects of climate change and displacement. There's some work on non-economic loss, things like that. And so those resources are all available through the task force website. And I mean, they're all big, long, detailed documents, but actually filling a gap. And then the other thing that the task force did was created a series of recommendations for state parties to the UNFCCC and to other stakeholders associated, and then trying to drive those recommendations through the climate change universe. So one of the goals is to, I would say, anchor the displacement conversation as part of loss and damage and as part of a core focus of the UNFCCC, the WIM, the XCOM, all of these institutions. And to be honest, that climate change world is big and heavy and bulky and complex, and navigating that is almost a full-time investment. And the task force has done that quite well. I would say not an official position, but part of the success of the task force in anchoring that issue has been to not deliberately try and rock the boat as much as possible, but to go in a slow and steady way over a number of years and to continue to have this language a central part of those discussions in a way that it wasn't before. So it's not a mechanism that I think is seeking radical change, but I think it's one of those mechanisms that is like making that conversation more normal as part of the climate change conversation. Another I think unintended goal, but benefit of the task force has been to bring a number of the main UN organizations and us as the Red Cross together, and also to have, in a way, have better coordination. So between UNHCR, between IOM, between IFRC, between UNDP, between ILO, and it's quite a light but effective way of kind of coordinating our approaches and just checking that we're all basically going in the same direction, not competing with each other too much, not duplicating each other too much. And so it's been quite an effective, and PDD, of course, Platform on Disaster Displacement is there, IDMC is there, having those kind of mostly Geneva-based organizations having that coordination forum, which is not the purpose of the task force, but I think it's like an unintended benefit of it. And then I think the real influence of the task force, which it's not realized yet, could be outside of the structure within which it is. So in the moment, it's part of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. It reports to the executive committee. It's very here. Trying to influence that should not be the goal of the task force, because that is a full-time job just to influence this very political organization and institution. It should really be to have a bigger effect globally. And for that, the task force needs to reimagine itself in a way and work much more closely with representative organizations from affected communities and not be such a kind of Geneva heavy bunch of institutional actors.
You know, one of the things we proposed within the last year it's a totally different topic, but it, you know, was a World Restitution Agency, right? So have a centralized body in place in a city like Geneva or somewhere to kind of coordinate all outstanding restitution claims in post-conflict and post-disaster societies, and then they'd manage them, they'd process them, there'd be an app that people could use to submit their information securely, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What are the prospects for, given the scale of climate displacement, given the amount of organizations that are involved in it now, particularly at the Geneva, you know, Bonn, New York kind of level? I mean, it's countless. Like from the outside, it's just like, oh no, another organization focusing on this issue. You know, what are the prospects for, you know, UNHCR has 10,000 staff now, 12,000 staff, and 6 people devoted to climate change matters, which is 6 more than they had 3 years ago. So it's an advancement, but it's still minuscule in the overall scheme of things. So do you see any utility, or are people talking at all about the idea of having a brand new international agency that would focus squarely and exclusively on the question of kind of environmental / climate displacement from a kind of solutions finding, you know, providing assistance sort of angle? Because the numbers just, you know, are staggeringly high, and probably as a category of affected people, higher than just about any other category in the world, except for people without access to clean water and sanitation. I mean, the number 2 category of, you know, in quotes, victims are climate displaced people, or people threatened with climate displacement. So it would seem that there is certainly a rationale for having an international agency of that sort.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to that final reflection I had, which is what is the way forward for this very complex, multifaceted problem? And is there kind of like a silver bullet type approach that we could invest in? And I think everyone wants that. Whether a new UN or otherwise international organization is that silver bullet or not, I'm not sure. But I mean, I remember having a conversation with Difford, rest in peace, in London, and talking about this issue, and he was saying, but basically, unless you can give us something new to invest in, we're just going to continue to fund IOM in the Pacific Islands. Like, we need something to kind of invest in that's transformative, and we don't have that pitch at the moment.
Right.
What you have is like a giant issue, and you're right, a number of organizations grappling with how do they institutionally arrange themselves to address it. Not my official position, but I think UNHCR probably struggling with that the most. I don't think it's just a recognition of the lack of interest in that topic, but a recognition of institutionally and mandate, where does this issue sit for UNHCR, and what is the appetite for that internally and externally? And that's why you have a climate action plan created by Andrew and the team that talks about all sorts of stuff that's not climate displaced people. It talks about greening, refugee camps, and you know, that's a problem and a challenge with the complexity of this issue. Is if you just say climate and displacement, there's so many points of intersection that you can steer the conversation any direction you want. You can start talking, Shahjahan, about Rohingya in Cox's Bazar and the fact that they're now vulnerable to climate impacts. That's a link between climate and displacement. It's not what the Peninsula Principles are about. It's not what we need to invest in, but it's a way of diverting the topic to something that's more institutionally palatable and able to be focused on without rocking the boat. There's also a number of initiatives, not just organization, but multi-agency initiatives and UN-led initiatives to look at this. So from different angles. So you have the high-level panel on internal displacement, you have the UN action agenda, UN Secretary General's action agenda on internal displacement. You have 2 initiatives spiraling off that. You have Robert Piper's office on durable solutions to internal displacement, where he is looking at internal displacement also in climate-related contexts. So one of the countries that they will focus on is Vanuatu, for example. So he and his office and that initiative is another entry point into this topic through the UN. At the same time, in parallel, you also have the UN Interagency Standing Committee, review of the humanitarian response to internal displacement. And you've got a team basically hired by Norwegian Refugee Council and made up of a bunch of ODI people to make a review of how is the humanitarian system responding to internal displacement, including climate and disaster-related internal displacement. And they're going to make a series of either radical or actionable recommendations to the IASC deputies at the end of the year. And that may or may not include, as Shahjahan mentioned, like a new displacement cluster at the local level to respond to this. So there's also these kind of UN interagency initiatives, but I think not just on the climate topic, but more generally, if you'd ask the bigger question about migration and displacement generally, I would say over the last 10 years, we've seen an increasing, and there's got to be a better word, but like siloification of all of these different ways that people are moving. You have a global compact on migration, the first time we've ever had a new normative framework that addresses all aspects of migration, but not asylum seekers, not refugees, and not IDPs, no way. Then you have a global compact on refugees that kind of creates some new framework in a way, but does not include migrants and does not include IDPs, although in some situations it might. You then have the high-level panel just looking at IDPs. You have the durable solutions just on IDPs, and these initiatives are basically completely separate. And when we go to an event in New York last year, the International Migration Review Forum, states don't know what they're talking about. They're talking IDPs, refugees, whatever. We're trying to bring a refugee to the forum, and UN agencies tell us don't bring a refugee. This is a migration forum. And I think if you put this issue at the heart of those conversations, it just makes a complete nonsense of separating all of these discussions that basically reflect UN agency mandates and turf battles and actually are a barrier to creating a holistic integrated approach, silver bullet or not, solution to this issue.
Well, one of the, like, I'll just mention a couple of things and then we'll see if that raises anything, and then otherwise we'll hit the road. But so we've done all these calculations recently trying to, we always work very much at the ultra macro level to try to sort of diagnose the scale of the problem. And we've recently done all these calculations and we've come up with this figure, $1.7 trillion. That's 12 zeros, is what's needed in order to provide permanent housing, land, and property rights solutions for the entire global population of climate displaced people. Sounds like a big number. Vis-a-vis the budget of the UN, it is a big number. Vis-a-vis the global economy, it's a small number. But it's putting numbers like that on the table that I think we collectively need to do much more of, like showing exactly how much it's going to cost. And also related to that, calculating how much land is going to be needed in order to provide new land resources to those who need them. And in that light, we've been pushing this idea now for some years that government should institute a system of climate land banks in each country so that land can be held in trust for communities that need it in the event that they have no other place to go, and they would get that land, from a state land resource at no cost, and then begin, life anew. And then the third point I just want to make is this whole question of governance, the whole question of nation states, the whole question of nationalities and passports and ability to cross borders is also something that will need to be very deeply structurally looked at in coming years as the scale of the problem worsens and as local solutions become less and less, and as people have to move from the equatorial regions increasingly northwards and southwards to get away from the oppressive heat, and beginning to think now and putting on the table now ideas about new forms of citizenship, new forms of migration rights, new forms of like world citizenship, the issue I work on so much. They're already discussing a Pacific passport plan in the Pacific to enable people to move more freely between nations, similar to the European Union model. But this whole issue of climate change is horrible, but it's also an opportunity for us to reevaluate the biggest questions of all, Are the institutions we have satisfactory? But is the system of governance we've chosen in economics satisfactory to plan 100, 200, 500 years into the future? And we should all be thinking yes about the little guys that are suffering now, but we do also need to put our minds to the bigger long-term issues down the road, because what we have in place today is absolutely never going to be adequate to address the scale of the problem that we're collectively facing in the context of very rapidly worsening climate change throughout the world. So would anyone else like to add anything now?
I wondered, because there's also increasing attention to indigenous knowledge and the views and rights of indigenous groups. Are there also discussions in this context, as Scott was just suggesting, like a new institution on climate displacement, or otherwise, as you were discussing, not that way, maybe in an interagency kind of format? But is there also a way, discussions on that level, to rethink who makes these decisions? That, for instance, indigenous groups are getting more sort of the lead in informing those, leading such policy discussions also on an international level, or is it still very much sort of, how it's been done always, more at Geneva in particular? Just wondered if there are changes in that context. With sort of who has the power to shape those decisions on an international level.
You want to take that, Khaled? Or you want me to say something?
Go ahead, and then
No, I mean, Khaled has to talk about it because, I think the human rights world is such an important anchor for indigenous issues. So I'm sure he's got something to say. Just from our side, there's probably two aspects, Ingrid, that we're looking at more from the humanitarian side. And one is the specific risks that indigenous communities are facing connected to climate-related displacement. And I mean, I think, again, prescient of the Peninsula Principles to have Robin Bronin as part of the initiative and looking at the specific risks and challenges of specific indigenous communities in a context where you have, in principle, a functioning government, functioning federal reserves and resources, but still an inability to design a solution. And 2 weeks ago, I was in Ottawa, talking to the Red Cross there about other specific indigenous communities in Canada and questions of relocation, questions of displacement that are quite specific to those communities. But then the other side is when indigenous communities get kind of like wrapped up in a bigger dynamic, and their specific rights and values and need to be respected. And we often see that in humanitarian response, including in the Philippines, for example, and in the design of housing, land, and property solutions for those people, starting with the shelter response and making sure that any support, both immediate and long-term, is in line with the values that Scott and all articulated in the right to adequate housing, which respects those, are the central part of that value.
Yeah, but I'm more wondered, like, but maybe Khaled knows that, like, if there are also initiatives, more on an international level, where there's some, more forum of different international indigenous groups coming together and shaping sort of how they would see we need to define policies on climate displacement and mobility. Or is it more really in local specific contexts that they get involved, or does it also come, I don't know, more regional or international level that there it gets institutionalized? Or
I mean, from the human rights perspective, there is obviously the Special Rapporteur in Indigenous Peoples plays a leading crucial role in raising awareness and addressing the issue. And in the past, there were the functioning of these special rapporteurs. They are mandated to do so-called annual thematic reports, and then they have the possibility to conduct country visits, which are kind of They have a fact-finding portion in it, and where they analyze and assess the situation and do recommendations. And in the past, I remember the previous Victoria Topoulos. She did address prominently climate change and the adverse impact of it on the rights of indigenous peoples. And there is also in New York a permanent forum on indigenous peoples, and this topic has been addressed. And I think there was also, the mandate was crucial also in bridging, the separation of the human rights address from the climate change dialogue. She was leading these rapporteurs, and also together with previous high commissioners to just advocate for the rights-based approach, which also includes the specific participation and rights of indigenous peoples. So I think change is a bit like with the Peninsula Principles, often from these special rapporteurs, because they are independent from the UN system, they're entrusted with the mandate. Often their reports are really addressing, quite frankly, the issues and come up with recommendations. But until they impact global intergovernmental processes, or especially the climate change environment or sphere, it took some time. But in Paris, they were leading, and there's a lot of documentation and reports on that. There was one thing that I wanted to mention also with regard to migrants in general. As you know, OHHR is has International Human Rights Convention on the Rights of Migrants, but that hasn't experienced full ratification and acceptance, especially by the global north. And when we talk about migration, displacement, and also thanks to the 2 global compacts, I think that there were here and there very timid initiatives how to bring up this convention, or whether there is any interest to transform that instrument into a contemporary human rights treaty that would address these rights, and would also kind of pass the test of time, which is currently not the case for various reasons, but also for the conceptual approach of this convention. So, but it didn't go far. So that is, these are the two elements that I wanted to share. I'll stop here.
Thank you.
All right. And I think too, Ingrid, if you look like in reverse, if you look at the experience of the Guna Yala indigenous group in Panama and the Torres Strait Islanders here in Australia, both indigenous groups, in terms of how they, in the case of the Guna Yala, how they have arranged their own relocation from man-made islands onto the mainland territory, which is also theirs. And the lessons learned from that are really profound. And then also the way the Torres Strait Islanders here, Aboriginal peoples, have put forth both domestic cases and international cases, trying to hold the government of Australia to account. So that's more local to the international. But those are also really useful. And lots of some of the best lessons in the world are really being driven by indigenous people fighting against climate displacement, essentially. Same thing in the state of Louisiana.
Why I was asking. Yeah,
like all over the place. It seems, given the fact that they're only 10% of humanity, but they're definitely far higher percentage of kind of, crucial, precedent-setting decisions have indigenous people at the core.
That's why I was asking. That's why I thought it could be relevant to get that together in a more sort of global scale, and sort of could maybe help to think of more advanced and solutions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good. That's
Yeah.
great. That's great. So,
Scott,
so thanks. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Yes,
I have one
sure,
question,
come by.
last question. Because our peninsula principle is particularly discussing about the IDP, internally displaced people, and solution within the states. But reality is cross-border migration is also happening, and cross-border displacement is also happening. And you know that the some country already to some country already disappearing. So in that sense, what are you thinking, or do you have any plan in future to make something for the cross-border migration, the cross-border displacement?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know if displacement solutions per se will like work on this issue in the same way that we have with the, the peninsula principles and stuff, but there are groups in place now that are, like the platform on disaster displacement in Geneva and a number of others that are, trying to work more on this whole cross-border question. But again, yes, there's 5 or 6, 10 groups working on it, but to me, what's lacking is, the simple fact that more and more people, whether we like it or not, I mean, when we developed the Peninsula Principles, and I think to this day, the overwhelming majority of people displaced by climate change will try to stay within their own borders, right? They will try, but increasingly they will not be able to. There won't be local solutions possible. That's certainly the case on the islands, but it's increasingly the case in other countries as well. So more and more attention does need to be paid to that whole question of who can cross a border, what rights do they have? Should national passports be the only way we identify ourselves? Should there be a new form of global passport starting in 2024? Every single person in the world should be born a national of their country, but a world citizen at the same time, which would give them universal travel rights. So all of those kind of questions need to be, discussed as far as I'm concerned, because it's only in that way can we expect at least a somewhat painless, somewhat orderly mass movement, which is infinitely larger than what we have now, because that is undoubtedly, unless there's some miracle, undoubtedly in the next long term, 50 to 100 years, that is what's going to happen. I mean, people in places now which cannot even imagine moving because of climate change will move. And, they will move because they simply can't comfortably live where they're living. And that number is, going to go from the millions to the tens of millions to the hundreds of millions in the not too distant future. And we don't have adequate answers to this yet. We don't, the human race wants to stay home, that people want to stay home. It's only 3% of the world population lives outside of their country of birth, right? And most of those do it out of necessity. And a few, like me and Zeke and Viraj, we do it because it's interesting and fun. We do it out of choice, right? But the vast majority do it because they have to. But it's still 97% of people are living in the country where they were born. So there is a reluctance to move for all sorts of reasons. And people are going to have to change. And more people will move. And the whole world is going to look different in 100 years, way more different than it looks now compared to 100 years ago in 1923. There's going to be whole regions which are now inhabited by people that are not inhabited by people. There's going to be all sorts of regions, particularly in the northern climates, which will be hosting mega cities where it's now just tundra and frozen land, and there's nothing there. But in 100 years, there will be cities there in a temperate climate. So, I mean, we're talking about an issue which is so huge, so overarching, it's so massive in scale and world changing that we simply have to start dealing more in the end with this cross-border question. And in a world of, increasing authoritarianism, increasing insular, looking inward, autocracies, authoritarianism, stopping people from coming in, being fearful of the foreigner, etc. That is exactly not the approach that we need, but in a way one can predict why that, it's pretty clear why that sort of attitude is gaining traction in lots of countries in the world, but that's obviously not going to solve the problem. So it's a huge, huge, huge thing. So, will not be solved tomorrow. That's for sure. That's for sure. So any other comments by anybody? So by the way, just have we've fully overhauled the DS website in conjunction with this project. So have a look at the displacementsolutions.org website. We have brand new versions of the Peninsula Principles with which look even nicer than the first round. So we'll send you some of those digital versions to all of your emails. And if you can, distribute those and just let people know that we're celebrating the 10th anniversary this year. All sorts of activities are planned, get it on people's agendas, and hopefully all of us in our own ways can, push the ball a little bit further. And thank you again. I love working with all of you. I love all of you, and hope that, we'll see each other in person real soon.